4 children were rummaging through the trash behind his kitchen in the darkness. Gideon Cross stood watching from the window, the coldest man in Montana, the one the whole town feared, and felt something break silently in his chest. The oldest, a boy of about 10, picked up the hardened crusts of bread from the snow and carefully wrapped them in his coat, not for himself, but to take home to his mother. Gideon had buried his heart for 8 years. Tonight, it began to beat again, and that would change everything, including his life. If you are reading this story, please like and comment your city name below. I want to know how far my story has come. Watch until the end, because this is a journey you won't want to miss a single moment. The wind came down from the northern mountains like something with a grudge. It hit the Cross Ranch from the northwest, the way it always did in December, finding every gap in the barn siding, every crack between the logs of the bunkhouse wall, every poorly chinked seam in the main house where the mortar had dried and crumbled over the years. Gideon Cross had lived through 11 Montana winters on this land, and he still hadn't entirely made peace with the sound it made at night. That low, hollow moan that wasn't quite a whistle and wasn't quite a voice, but sat somewhere uncomfortable between the two. He was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold when he heard them. Not voices. He wouldn't have called it that. More like movement where there shouldn't have been any. A scraping, careful kind of sound from behind the kitchen wall, near the narrow alley between the main house and the storage shed where Hector left the day's scraps before heading to his bunkhouse for the night. Gideon had a rule about that alley. Nothing went in it after dark. Coyotes had learned that lesson the hard way, and any ranch hand who let a dog run loose back there heard about it. He didn't reach for his rifle. He wasn't sure why. Habit said to. 11 years of frontier instinct said to. But something about the sound was wrong for an animal. Too deliberate, too careful, too aware of itself. He stood slowly and moved to the window that looked out over the side yard, and he stood back from it a few feet so the lamplight from inside wouldn't frame him, and he looked out into the dark. The snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, and it was still coming down, thick and steady, the kind that muffled sound and turned the world into a gray-white nothing beyond 30 feet. But the lamp above the kitchen door threw enough light that he could see the narrow space beside the shed, and what he saw there stopped him cold in a way the wind never had. 4 children. The oldest was a boy, maybe 10 years old, wearing a coat that was 2 sizes too large and missing 2 of its buttons. His boots were wrong for the weather. Flat-soled, thin leather, the kind that belonged in September, not December. He was crouched over the scrap bucket Hector had left out, pulling pieces of food out with both hands and setting them carefully on a piece of cloth he'd spread on the snow. Beside him, a girl of maybe 7 or 8 watched what he was doing with an expression that wasn't hunger exactly. It was something more controlled than hunger, something that had already decided not to show too much. Behind them, 2 smaller children stood pressed together, a boy and a girl, probably 4 and 6, their faces almost entirely hidden inside the hoods of their wrappings. The older boy worked quickly, but without panic. He wasn't grabbing and stuffing food into his own mouth. He was sorting, setting aside pieces of bread, a chunk of something that had been meat, a half-eaten biscuit that Hector had probably meant to finish and forgotten. He was building a small pile, and when he had what he wanted, he folded the cloth around it carefully, like he'd done this before, and tucked it inside his coat. Gideon stood at the window and didn't move for almost a full minute. He was not a man who spent much time examining what he felt. He had learned, through a particular and painful education, that feelings were mostly a distraction from the business of staying alive and keeping things running. He owned 1,200 acres of good grassland in the Gallatin Valley. He ran 400 head of cattle through summer and kept 80 through winter. He had 6 ranch hands he paid fairly and expected to work hard, a cook named Hector who had been with him since the beginning, and a horse he trusted more than most men he'd ever known. That was enough. That was everything he needed. He watched the oldest boy wrap that food up like it was something precious, and he felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for and didn't particularly want to examine. He went to the kitchen. He didn't think about it carefully. He moved to the stove where Hector had left the evening's leftovers, a half pot of beef and potato stew. Still warm under the heavy lid, a half loaf of bread, some salt pork that hadn't been touched. He found a wooden bowl and filled it. He found another. He cut bread. He wrapped the salt pork in cloth. He put all of it in a crate and carried it to the back door. He opened the back door slowly, trying not to let the hinges announce him. He was not fast enough. The oldest boy heard the door and spun around with the kind of speed that only happens when you've spent time being afraid of being caught. His arms came up slightly, not quite a defensive posture, but close, and he put himself between Gideon and the three younger children in a movement so automatic it was clear he'd done it before. They stared at each other across about 20 feet of snow. The boy was frightened. Gideon could see that. But he didn't run. He held his ground with his chin up and his jaw set and his eyes tracking everything at once. And in that moment, Gideon recognized something in him that he hadn't seen in a long time. The specific, exhausted defiance of someone who has run out of options but refuses to show it. Gideon set the crate down on the back step. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what there was to say that wouldn't make it worse. Instead, he stepped back from the crate and moved away from the door and stood still. Just stood there. In the snow and the cold without his coat, letting the boy see that he wasn't moving toward them. The boy looked at the crate, looked at Gideon, looked at the crate again. "We weren't stealing," the boy said. His voice was careful and quiet, like he was testing how far it would carry. "What's in the bucket?" "It was already thrown out." "I know," Gideon said. The boy blinked. He'd clearly been prepared for something else. "My name's Noah," the boy said after a moment. "These are my brothers and sisters, Eli, June, and May." He said their names like they were important, like he needed Gideon to understand they were real people with real names, not just children scavenging behind someone's shed. "Gideon Cross," Gideon said. The recognition hit Noah's face immediately. This was the man who owned the land, the man the whole valley walked carefully around. Gideon watched him weigh something in a way that no 10-year-old should have to weigh anything. "We'll go," Noah said. He started to gather the younger ones. "There's food in that crate," Gideon said. "It's yours if you want it." Noah stopped. "We don't take charity," the boy said, and he said it quietly, without anger, the way you say something you've been taught carefully by someone who believed it. "It's not charity," Gideon said. "Hector made too much. It'll go to waste." It was a lie, and they both probably knew it, but it was the kind of lie that gave someone a way to keep their pride. And Gideon had enough experience with pride to understand what it was worth. Noah looked at him for a long moment. The snow kept falling between them, steady and quiet. "Our mother," Noah said slowly. "She always eats last. She makes sure we eat first, every time." He paused. "There's enough here for her too?" Gideon looked at the crate. He hadn't thought about a mother. He hadn't thought further than the children standing in his alley. He thought about it now. Someone at home, waiting, eating last, making sure 4 children had something before she took anything herself. "Yes," he said, "there's enough." Noah crossed the yard and picked up the crate. He was stronger than he looked. He held it with both hands and turned back to the younger children and said something to them too quietly for Gideon to hear. And the small one, May, looked around her brother at Gideon for just a second before Noah moved them toward the gate at the back of the fence. Gideon stood in the snow and watched them go. He stood there longer than was reasonable, until the cold had gotten into his shoulders properly and the wind was pushing at his back, and he wasn't sure what he was waiting for. He just stood there, in the dark and the quiet, with the snow coming down around him, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He went back inside and poured his cold coffee out and didn't make a new pot. He slept badly, which wasn't new. Gideon Cross had slept badly for going on 8 years, ever since the winter of 1881, when he'd come back to the same land after 6 months in Billings, trying to settle a dispute with a railroad surveying company, and found the woman he'd spent 3 years building a life with gone. Not dead, not taken, just gone. Packed up her things and left with a man named William Calloway, who owned a hotel in Helena and had significantly more money and significantly smoother manners than Gideon had ever possessed. She'd left a note. 11 words. "I cannot live like this any longer. Please don't come after me." He hadn't. He'd spent about a week being a different kind of man, drinking too much, working too little, letting things slide in a way that his ranch hand at the time, an older fellow named Abe, had watched with visible concern but hadn't commented on until Gideon had missed feeding the horses 2 days running. Then Abe had said, simply and without judgment, "The horses still need you, even if nobody else does." Gideon had gone and fed the horses. And then he'd gone back to being the man he'd learned to be. Efficient, self-sufficient, silent. He'd built walls around the parts of himself that wanted things he apparently wasn't going to get. And he'd gotten on with the business of surviving, which in Montana in the 1880s was enough to keep any man fully occupied. He hadn't trusted anyone with anything that mattered since then. He wasn't proud of it exactly. He just knew it was true. He lay in bed that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about a 10-year-old boy wrapping scraps of food in a cloth and folding it carefully and tucking it inside his coat, not for himself, but to carry home to someone else. He thought about the way Noah had planted himself between his siblings and Gideon without even thinking about it. He thought about our mother always eats last. He got up before dawn and went to the kitchen and started making biscuits. He wasn't much of a cook. Hector handled the meals. But Gideon had learned enough over the years to manage the basics, and biscuits were something he could do when the need was there. He made 2 pans of them and wrapped them in cloth while they were still warm. He added dried venison from the stores, a jar of Hector's preserved apples, a block of hard cheese. He thought about it for a moment and added a small jar of rendered fat and a bag of dried beans that could stretch into multiple meals. He put it all in a canvas sack and went out before first light. He didn't know exactly where the family lived. He knew the general direction Noah had gone, south along the fence line toward the old Dunmore property, which had been empty since Dunmore had packed up and gone to Oregon 3 years back. It took him 20 minutes of walking in the dark, following the fence posts and the gray line of the sky above the mountains to the east, before he found what he was looking for. It was barely a shelter. 3 walls of it were original, old Dunmore construction, rough logs badly chinked, gaps visible even from a distance. The 4th wall appeared to have been patched with boards that didn't match, various widths, clearly scavenged from somewhere and nailed up more or less where they fit. The roof sagged in the middle. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, which meant either the fire had gone out or there was nothing left to burn with. Snow had drifted against the door almost knee-high. Gideon stood in the dark and looked at it. A light appeared in the small window. A candle, moving, someone up early. Moving carefully, like they were trying not to wake the others. He set the canvas sack down against the door, making as little noise as possible. He hesitated there for a moment, looking at the sagging roof, the gap between the mismatched boards where the wind would come straight through, the way the whole structure leaned slightly to the left as if it was tired of standing up. Then he turned and walked back to his ranch in the dark. Hector found him in the barn when the sun came up, rehanging a door that had never quite sat right in its frame. Hector was a compact, watchful man in his early 50s who had come to Gideon's ranch from New Mexico and had never offered much in the way of explanation for why he'd come this far north. He was the best camp cook Gideon had ever employed, and he had the specific quality of seeing everything and commenting on almost nothing, which Gideon had come to value more than almost any other human trait. He watched Gideon work on the door for a while without saying anything. "Somebody took the scraps last night," Hector said finally, "before I got out there this morning." "I know," Gideon said. Hector was quiet for a moment. "Children, 4 of them." "I thought I heard something yesterday evening," Hector said. He didn't ask anything further. He stood there a moment longer watching Gideon wrestle with the door hinge, and then he said, "There's going to be more snow tonight. I heard it in the air this morning." "Make extra at supper," Gideon said. Hector nodded once and went back to the kitchen. Mom. The extra food disappeared from the back step that night, and the night after, and the night after that. Gideon didn't watch for them after the first time. He'd made the mistake of standing near the window on the second night, and Noah had spotted him from the alley and frozen like a deer. And after that, Gideon had understood that being watched made it harder for them. So he left things and went away. He left food, and then he started adding other things. A bundle of firewood tied with rope left beside the fence gate. A wool blanket from the bunkhouse stores, older but still good. A box of candles. He didn't talk to anyone about it. His ranch hands would have noticed things missing eventually, but Gideon had built a reputation for being unpredictable in small ways. Buying things in bulk, when the prices were right, giving things away to settlers who were struggling. And nobody asked him to explain his inventory decisions. He started paying more attention to the Dunmore property when he rode the fence line, which he did every 3 days regardless of weather. He could see the shelter from the ridge above, and what he saw, the more he looked, was a structure that wouldn't make it through February. One bad storm, the right angle of wind, and that sagging center beam was going to come down. He thought about this for several days without doing anything about it. He was not someone who liked to insert himself into other people's lives. He had learned that lesson in a particular way, by watching someone he thought he knew turn out to be entirely different from what he'd believed, and understanding afterward that he had simply projected what he wanted to see onto a person who was living a separate and incompatible life alongside his. He had since made it a policy to see people as they were rather than as he needed them to be, which mostly meant keeping enough distance that the difference never mattered. But he kept thinking about that roof. On a Thursday, 10 days after he'd first seen the children in the alley, he came back from riding the north fence and found something wedged into the crack of his back door that wasn't there when he'd left. He pulled it out and turned it over in his hands. It was a drawing, done in charcoal on the back of a scrap of brown paper, the kind of paper flour sacks were made from. Rough, childish, clearly made by someone young enough that the proportions were still approximate at best. It showed a figure on a horse. The horse had an enormous round body and legs that didn't entirely match up, and the figure was wearing a hat with a wide brim. Below it, in careful, unpracticed letters, "The Quiet Rider." Gideon stood at the back door holding this drawing for a long time. He was not a man who had been given many things without expectation of return. He thought about the 4 children in the snow, and the boy who had planted himself in front of them, and the woman somewhere in that failing shelter who ate last. He thought about what it cost a 10-year-old to compose himself enough to spell out those words carefully on a piece of old flour sack, and what it said about what they couldn't give him, except this. He folded the drawing and put it in his coat pocket. That evening he rode into Harlow, which was the nearest town of any size, about 6 miles south along the river road. He found Frank Ellers at the hardware store, who sold lumber and supplies, and he spent an hour going over what was available and what could be moved by wagon before the next storm came in. "Building something?" Frank asked. "Fixing something," Gideon said. He arranged for a delivery in 2 days' time and rode back in the dark. Right. He hadn't planned to meet her. He hadn't planned most of what happened in those weeks. It occurred to him later that all of it had been reactive, one thing at a time, no grand design, just a series of decisions made in the moment without much thought for where they'd lead. That was, he supposed, how most of the things that changed your life actually happened, not with intention, with instinct. He arrived at the Dunmore property early on a Sunday morning with Frank Ellers' delivery wagon behind him, loaded with lumber and basic supplies. He'd calculated that he could use 2 of his own ranch hands for the physical work. He'd told them he had a repair job to do on the old Dunmore place, and he'd need their help Saturday and Sunday. Neither of them had asked questions, which was the main advantage of paying people well and leaving them alone the rest of the time. What he hadn't calculated was that Clara Whitmore would be outside when they arrived. She was at the side of the shelter, doing something with rope and a piece of board, working at fixing a gap in the wall with her hands in the cold without gloves. And when she heard the wagon, she straightened and turned, and Gideon got his first clear look at her in full daylight. She was younger than he'd imagined, perhaps 30, perhaps a few years either side of it, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins in the cold and was blowing around her face. She was wearing a coat that had been good once and had seen hard use since, and her hands were reddened from the cold. She had the look of someone who had been tired for a long time and had stopped expecting that to change. She looked at the wagon, looked at Gideon, looked at his 2 ranch hands. Her expression was not grateful. It was guarded, cautious, and behind that, proud in a way that had a lot of experience being tested. "Mr. Cross," she said. Her voice was even. She knew who he was. Everyone in the valley knew who he was. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. A moment of silence in which they both adjusted to the fact that this was the first time they'd spoken, but not the first time they'd been in contact with each other in a way that mattered. "I haven't asked for anything," she said. "No," he said. "You haven't." "My children," she started. "Your children are not why I'm here," he said, which was not entirely accurate but was true enough. "That beam," he said, and pointed at the roof. "The center one. It's not going to hold past February. I'd bet your life on it, except it's your life I'm trying to avoid betting." She looked at the roof. She'd clearly already looked at the roof a great many times and known exactly what she was looking at. "I don't have money to pay you," she said. Her voice didn't apologize for it. She was stating a fact the way you state weather. "It's raining. This is what's true. Here we are." "I'm not asking for money," Gideon said. "Then what are you asking for?" He thought about it. He hadn't exactly thought about what he was asking for because he hadn't thought of it in those terms. He was asking for the chance to fix a roof that was going to kill 4 children and their mother before March, which seemed like reason enough. But he understood that she was asking something different. She was asking what he expected from her in exchange, and what the cost of accepting this would be. And he recognized the question because it was one he'd asked himself about other things in other circumstances, and always arrived at the same answer: nothing is free. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "The roof is going to come down. I have lumber. That's the whole of it." Clara Whitmore looked at him for a long time with those careful, tired eyes. "The children," she said finally. "They've been leaving their drawings on your door." "I know. I told them not to bother you." "They're not bothering me." Another long pause. "Noah said you were kind to them," she said. It came out slightly stiff, like she was reading from something she'd rehearsed. Like kindness directed at her children was something she still didn't entirely know how to respond to. Grateful for it, angry that they needed it, afraid of what it meant. "Noah's a good boy," Gideon said. Something crossed her face at that. Something quick and real. Not the careful nothing she'd been showing him up until then. "Yes," she said. "He is." She looked at the wagon. She looked at the 2 ranch hands waiting patiently in the cold. She looked at the roof and then back at Gideon. "All right," she said, "but I'll work alongside. I'm not going to stand by and watch while other people work on my house." "I'd expect that," Gideon said. He thought, and immediately suppressed the thought, that it was the first completely honest exchange he'd had with another person in longer than he could easily calculate. They worked through the day, all 5 of them. Gideon and his 2 men and Clara, and Noah, who was old enough to hand things up and hold boards in place, and who worked with the same concentrated seriousness he apparently applied to everything. The 3 younger children appeared at intervals, watching from a cautious distance, occasionally bringing water or asking Noah questions he answered without stopping work. It was cold, hard work. The beam had to come down before the new one could go up, and the roof had to be partially dismantled in the process, which meant several hours of everyone working fast in the open air with the December wind making its opinions known. One of his ranch hands, a man named Dutch, who had a gift for carpentry, took the lead on the structural work, and Gideon deferred to him without making a thing of it. He could do most kinds of ranch work, but he'd never been a natural carpenter, and he knew enough to know when someone else should be running a thing. Clara worked without complaint and without asking to be thanked. She carried lumber, held boards, climbed up to hand things through gaps when her lighter frame made it easier. She had clearly done physical work for most of her life. When Dutch told her to hold something steady and keep tension on it, she held it steady and kept tension on it without discussion. Toward late afternoon, when the new beam was set and the worst of the gaps had been closed, Gideon came down from the roof and found her standing looking up at the structure with her arms crossed and her expression complicated. "It'll hold," he said. "I can see that," she said. He waited to see if she was going to say anything else. She didn't for a long moment. Then, "My husband built this," she said, "or most of it. He wasn't a good builder." A pause. "He wasn't a bad man, but he wasn't what he told me he was either. He thought he could homestead, and he couldn't, and he knew it by the end, but he didn't tell me until he was dying." She said it flatly, like old news. "I've been making do with what he left." Gideon didn't say anything. He wasn't sure there was anything to say that wouldn't miss the point. "The children have been calling you the quiet writer," she said. "I saw the drawing. June did that one. She's 7. She thinks you're a kind of story," Claire said. "I told her you're a real person, and real people are more complicated." A brief pause. "I'm not sure she believed me." "She's probably right to be skeptical," Gideon said. Clara looked at him then, a direct, assessing look that he suspected she used on most things she was trying to understand. He met it without looking away, which seemed to be the right response, because something in her posture shifted slightly. Not relaxed exactly, but recalibrated. "Thank you," she said. "For the food," And for this, you're welcome, he said. She nodded once, like that settled something. She turned and called to Noah, and the two of them went to start banking the evening fire in the rebuilt stove, and Gideon loaded the remaining lumber back onto the wagon. On the way home, Dutch rode beside him for a while without speaking. Then he said, "Good people." "Yes," Gideon said. "Hard way to live," Dutch said. "Yes," Gideon said. Dutch didn't say anything else, and neither did Gideon, and they rode the rest of the way back in the dark with the wind coming down hard from the north and the snow beginning again quietly and without apology, the way it always did in Montana in the deep part of winter. Gideon unsaddled his horse in the barn and rubbed him down and gave him extra feed, and then he stood in the lamplight of the barn for a while without moving, thinking about the drawing still folded in his coat pocket. The Quiet Rider. The slightly wrong spelling that made it somehow more real than if it had been perfect. He pulled it out and looked at it. The horse with its enormous round body, the figure in the wide-brimmed hat. Below it, those careful, impractical letters from a child who hadn't asked for anything except to give him something back. He went to the house and tacked the drawing on the wall above his desk, where he could see it from the chair where he did his accounts. He stood back and looked at it. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, and he still didn't have a name for it, and he was starting to think that might be all right. That maybe some things didn't need a name right away. That maybe some things just needed to be let alone to grow in the dark and the cold, the way certain things do in winter, slowly, without announcement, in ways you don't notice until the ground thaws and you look down and find that something is alive there that wasn't before. He went to bed, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he slept through the night. Outside, the snow kept falling on the Gallatin Valley, blanketing everything equally. The rich land and the poor shelter, the big house and the patched walls, the man who had everything, and the family that had almost nothing. And in the morning, when the light came back, the world would be white and unmarked, and whatever came next would be written fresh on it. The roof held through the first real storm of January. Gideon knew because he rode the fence line 3 days after the storm broke and swung south past the Dunmore property out of habit, or something he was calling habit, because calling it concern felt like more than he was ready to admit. The shelter stood solid. Smoke was coming from the chimney, which meant the stove was working and there was wood to burn, both of which he'd made sure of before the storm came in. He didn't stop. He didn't have a reason to stop. He turned his horse north and rode back to his own land and went about his day. But he noticed. He kept noticing things he hadn't noticed before, which was irritating in a low-grade, persistent way he couldn't quite shake. He noticed the temperature each morning when he stepped outside and calculated, involuntarily, whether it was cold enough to be dangerous in a poorly insulated shelter. He noticed when the wind shifted direction and thought about which wall it would hit first. He noticed the length of days and the angle of light, and whether there was enough time in the afternoon for a woman and 4 children to gather what they needed before dark came down. He was not, he told himself, responsible for any of that. He had fixed the roof. He had left food and firewood. He had done more than most men would have done, and considerably more than anyone expected of him. He was allowed to stop now. He didn't stop. The drawings kept appearing, not every day, but regularly, tucked into the crack of his back door, or weighted down by a stone on the back step, always on scraps of brown paper or the backs of things, always in charcoal or pencil, always the same figure on the same round-bodied horse. June, apparently, was the primary artist, though one of them, the lettering was different, more careful, had started adding words. "Thank you. We are warm." And once, in very small letters at the bottom of a drawing that showed a horse, and a figure standing beside a house with smoke coming from the chimney, "We had soup today." Gideon read that one 3 times. He understood that a child writing "We had soup today" as a significant piece of news was telling him something about what the days without soup had looked like. He folded that drawing and put it with the others in the small stack he'd started keeping in his desk drawer, tucked under the ranch ledger where nobody would find them without looking for them specifically. He was not a sentimental man. He told himself this while he was doing it. Hector figured it out on his own, which Gideon had expected. Hector had eyes that worked independently of whatever he was doing with his hands, and he'd been adding extra to his cooking for weeks without being asked, just quietly making more, leaving more in the pot, not commenting on what wasn't there in the morning. Her husband, Hector said one evening, not looking up from the stove. Whitmore, what happened to him? Homesteaded the Dunmore property. Couldn't make it work. Died last spring. Lung fever, Hector said. It wasn't a question. I think so. I don't know for certain. Hector stirred whatever was on the stove. She's from the East? Her speech. Indiana, maybe. Ohio. Gideon had registered the way she talked. Not the same clipped vowels as the frontier women who'd been born or raised in the territory. Something that still had a trace of somewhere else in it. Long way to come, Hector said. People come a long way for a lot of reasons, Gideon said. And stay for different ones, Hector said. And that was the end of that conversation. It was Dutch who first told him what people were saying in town. Dutch had gone into Harlow on a Wednesday for supplies and come back quieter than he'd left, which was noticeable because Dutch wasn't a quiet man by nature. He worked through the afternoon without his usual commentary, and at supper he ate fast and left early. And Gideon, who noticed these things, found him in the barn afterward checking a harness that didn't need checking. Say it, Gideon said. Dutch kept his eyes on the harness. People talk. People always talk. About what? A pause. Dutch turned the harness over in his hands. About you, and the Whitmore woman. Gideon was quiet for a moment. And what exactly are they saying? That you've been over there regular, that you rebuilt the place. Dutch set down the harness. Mabel Greer said she saw your wagon at the property back in December and told Agnes Pierce, and Agnes Pierce told, well, it went from there. What's the story now? Dutch looked uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who doesn't want to be delivering news they know the recipient is going to dislike. That it's improper. That a widow woman taking that kind of help from a man who's not family, they're saying things about her character mostly, and yours, not in a kind way. Gideon stood with his hands in his coat pockets and thought about Clara Whitmore standing in the cold fixing the wall of her shelter with bare hands, and about Noah carrying the crate of food with that careful, dignified stride, and about "We had soup today" written in small letters at the bottom of a drawing. Who's saying it loudest? He asked. Reverend Aldous had something in his Sunday remarks from what I heard, and Cole Granger's been talking at the feed store. Dutch paused. Cole Granger talks at the feed store about everything, so maybe that's less significant. Cole Granger, Gideon said, once tried to sell me a sick horse for the price of a healthy one and called it a fair deal. I know, Dutch said. I'm just telling you what I heard. I know you are, Gideon said. Thank you. He went back to the house and sat at his desk and looked at the drawing tacked to the wall. June's horse with the enormous round body, and felt the particular cold weight of a problem he'd seen coming without quite admitting he'd seen it coming. He hadn't thought about how it would look. That was the honest truth. And he was someone who tried to be honest with himself even when it was inconvenient, so he sat with it for a while rather than deflecting it. He had not thought about appearances. He had thought about a roof and a child's hunger and the specific sound of wind through gaps in boards that didn't match. And he had not thought past those things to the network of eyes and opinions and social arithmetic that governed frontier life in ways that were different from cities, but not less strict. Clara Whitmore would be the one who paid for it. That was clear. He was a man with land and reputation and enough standing that even the loudest talk would eventually run out of breath. She was a widow with 4 children and no standing at all except whatever she'd built by keeping herself respectable in a community that had very precise and unforgiving ideas about what respectable meant for a woman alone. He hadn't protected her from this. He'd caused it. He sat with that for a long time. He went to see her on a Friday morning, riding down in clear cold air with the sky a hard blue above the mountains. Noah was outside splitting wood, or trying to, the axe being slightly too large and heavy for him, though he was managing through sheer persistence. And he straightened when he saw Gideon coming and watched him approach with that measuring look he always had. "Morning," Gideon said. "Morning, Mr. Cross?" Noah set the axe down against the woodpile. "She's inside." Gideon dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post. "You don't have to stop on my account." "I know," Noah said, and picked the axe back up. There was something in the way he said it, not rude, just self-possessed, that reminded Gideon of Clara. He knocked on the door, which was a new door, properly hung, one of the things he'd had Dutch put in during the roof work. Clara opened it in about 30 seconds, which meant she'd probably seen him coming from the window. She looked at him the way she usually looked at him, alert, non-committal, waiting to see what the situation required. "Can I come in?" he asked. She stepped back from the door. The inside of the shelter was transformed from what it had been. It was still small, one main room and a sleeping area partitioned off by a curtain. But it was clean and organized with the kind of thoroughness that comes from making the most of very little. The children's bedding was stacked neatly in the corner. There were drawings on the wall. Not the ones sent to Gideon, but others, a whole gallery of them. The same round-bodied horses and stick figures and what appeared to be an ambitious attempt at a mountain that looked more like a loaf of bread. The stove was going properly, the pipe draw correct, the warmth real, and even throughout the small space. Two of the younger ones were at the table doing something with string, some kind of game, and they looked up when Gideon came in and then looked at their mother to read what expression to have, which was such a human thing to do that it caught him off guard for a second. "Go play in the back," Clara said to them, not unkindly. They gathered up their string and disappeared behind the curtain. Clara stood with her arms loosely crossed, not defensive exactly, but contained. She'd learned to take up a specific and limited amount of space, he noticed. Not shrinking, but precise. Nothing wasted. "I've heard what people are saying," he said, without preamble. He'd found over the years that leading up to an uncomfortable thing with small talk just made everyone more uncomfortable. Claire's expression didn't change. "So have I." "I should have thought about how it would look," he said. "I didn't. That was my failure." She looked at him for a moment. "It wasn't what you were thinking about." "No, but it should have been." "Maybe," she said. "I've thought about it. I knew the risk when I let you work on the roof." A pause. "I made that choice myself, Mr. Cross. I don't need you to take responsibility for a choice I made." It was said simply, without heat, but it landed like something thrown with intention. She was not, he was starting to understand, someone who handled being pitied gracefully. She could accept practical help if it was offered cleanly, without obligation or condescension attached to it. Being cast as someone who needed protecting, even from his own oversight, sat wrong with her, and he could see that clearly enough. "Fair enough," he said. "Agnes Pierce stopped by on Tuesday," Clara said, "to let me know what was being said. She tried to be kind about it." A brief pause. "She suggested I should make it clear I wasn't encouraging any kind of—" Clara stopped. "She suggested I make my position clear." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I would make whatever I pleased clear and that I appreciated her concern." Clara said it dryly, in a way that indicated the conversation with Agnes Pierce had not gone precisely as Agnes Pierce had intended. Something moved in Gideon's chest that might, under other circumstances, have been described as appreciation. "The talk will die down," he said. "Will it?" "Honestly, probably not before it does some damage." She nodded once, like that confirmed something she'd already calculated. "What I care about," she said, "is Noah. He's been hearing things from the boys in town when he goes for supplies. He hasn't told me directly, but I can see it on him when he comes back." Gideon thought about Noah splitting wood with a too-heavy axe, working through it by persistence, because persistence was what he had. "He's a tough kid," Gideon said. "He's 10, Claire said. And then, more quietly, "He shouldn't have to be this tough." There was no self-pity in it. It was just true, and she said it the way you say a true thing, plainly, and then you move on. And he moved on to the question he'd actually come to ask. "There's a cabin," he said, "on my property, the northeast corner, near the creek. It was built for a foreman years back. Nobody's used it in 2 years." He stopped. He'd rehearsed this part in his head on the ride over, and it had sounded more natural in his head. "It's solid. 4 rooms, proper fireplace, not just a stove. The roof is good." Clara was very still. "I'm not offering it as charity," he said, before she could say it. "I'd want work in return. I need someone to manage the household accounts and the supply ordering. Hector cooks. But the business of running the house, keeping the books for the household, that's been mine and I don't have time for it in addition to the ranch work." He paused. "You can read and do figures?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was careful. "Then it's a fair arrangement. Work for housing. Nobody could say it was anything other than that. He watched her work through it. She was good at not showing her thinking, but she wasn't entirely closed. He could see the calculations moving behind her eyes. The shelter versus a cabin. The cold versus 4 rooms and a proper fireplace. The talk they'd already generated versus a clearly defined employment arrangement. And the children, she said. They'd have the run of the property on the north side, away from the working areas. There's a good sledding hill near the creek, he added, and then wasn't entirely sure why he'd added that, except that it was true. Clara looked at the drawings on the wall, at the stacked bedding, at the curtain behind which 2 of her children were playing with string. I need to think about it, she said. Of course, he said. He turned to go. He was at the door when she said, Mr. Cross. He turned. The food, she said. Over these weeks, I haven't properly thanked you for that. You didn't need to. I know I didn't need to. I want to. She said it precisely, like there was a difference and she needed him to understand what it was. It kept them fed through December. She stopped. That mattered. Gideon nodded. He didn't say anything else. He went outside and untied his horse, and Noah was still at the woodpile, still working on it with the 2 heavy axe. And without saying anything, Gideon went and stood beside him and took the axe. When Noah set it down for a moment and showed him the different angle of grip, the way you let the weight of the axe do most of the work if you place your hands right, the positioning of the feet. Noah watched with complete attention the way he watched everything. Try it, Gideon said, and handed the axe back. Noah adjusted his grip, set his feet, swung. The log split clean. Noah looked at the 2 halves for a moment. Huh, he said. Same amount of work, Gideon said. Different direction. He rode home, thinking about that. Clara came to him 4 days later on a Tuesday morning, with Noah beside her and May on her hip, and the other 2 walking behind. She had thought about it in the way she did everything, completely, without shortcuts. He could tell because when she arrived at his door, she had already decided, and the decision had clearly not been made lightly or quickly, and she looked like someone who was committed to a thing and was done deliberating about it. The arrangement you described, she said. I'll take it, on the terms you stated. All right, he said. I want it understood clearly, she said. Between us. It's work for housing. That's the whole of it. That's the whole of it, he agreed. If anyone asks me, that's what I'll tell them. That's what I'll tell them too. She held his eyes for a moment, checking for something, and apparently found what she was looking for or didn't find what she was afraid of because she nodded. When can we move in? She asked. Today if you want, he said. Tomorrow at the latest. I'll have Dutch and Hector help move your things. What they moved didn't take long. It never does when people have had to pare down to what matters. They had the bedding, a few pieces of clothing, the cooking items Clara had brought from Indiana and held on to through everything, and the drawings. Clara took those down carefully from the wall and stacked them and wrapped them in cloth, which told Gideon something about her that he filed away without examining. The cabin had been standing empty long enough that it needed a morning of airing and a good fire to take the cold out of the walls. Hector went ahead and made sure the stove was drawing right, and the firewood was stocked, and Dutch checked the shutters and found one hinge that needed replacing, and Gideon replaced it himself while Clara organized the inside with the swift efficiency of someone who'd had to establish a home in difficult circumstances before and had learned to do it without sentiment. The children moved through the cabin with the specific energy of children processing something too large for ordinary emotion. Eli, who was 6, ran from room to room several times, apparently just to verify that there were still 4 rooms on the 3rd pass. June stood in the kitchen and looked at the stove with an expression that was purely practical. She was calculating how it worked and what you could do with it, which Gideon thought she had probably been doing in one way or another her whole short life. May, the youngest, found a corner near the fireplace and sat down in it with her cloth rabbit and didn't move, apparently satisfied. Noah found him at the woodpile behind the cabin, where Gideon was stacking what Dutch had brought over. "Can I help?" Noah asked. "Sure," Gideon said, and showed him where to put things. They worked for a while without talking. That was something about Noah that Gideon had noticed from the start. He didn't talk just to fill silence, which was a quality that took most adults considerably longer to develop, if they developed it at all. "The boys in town," Noah said after a while. "They said things." Gideon kept stacking. "I heard. They said my mother was—" Noah stopped, started again, more carefully. "They said she wasn't decent." Gideon set down what he was holding and turned to look at the boy directly. Noah was looking at the woodpile, jaw set, the way Clara's jaw set when she was managing something. "People say things," Gideon said, "especially when they don't understand something and they're uncomfortable about not understanding it." "That's not a good reason," Noah said. "No," Gideon said. "It's not. It's just a true one." Noah thought about that. What do you do when people say things that aren't true? Gideon thought about the 11 words in that letter. "I cannot live like this any longer. Please don't come after me." He thought about 6 months in Billings and coming back to an empty house and what he'd done with the things people had said about that. "You decide whether they matter," he said. "The person doing the talking. If they matter to you, then what they say matters. If they don't—" He stopped. "Your mother knows who she is. You know who she is. That's the line that holds when the other lines are down." Noah was quiet for a moment. He picked up a piece of wood and fit it into the stack. "Are you going to let them talk?" Noah asked. "For now," Gideon said. Noah seemed to consider this as a tactical position rather than a moral failure, which was perhaps the most frontier thing about him. "All right," he said, and they finished the woodpile in companionable quiet. The weeks that followed were strange, in the way that arrangements between people always are when they're built on practicality, and both parties are trying very hard not to make it into something it isn't. Clara came to the main house each weekday morning and sat at the desk in the small room off the kitchen that Gideon cleared for her, and she worked through the household accounts and the supply records and the ordering ledger with a precision and speed that made clear she'd done this kind of work before. She found 2 ordering errors in the first week, places where Gideon had been overcharged by a supplier who apparently counted on his customers not checking the arithmetic, and corrected them without comment, leaving the corrected figures on his desk with a brief note explaining the discrepancy. He raised the wages he'd mentally assigned her. He didn't tell her immediately. He wanted to see the full scope of what she could do before he named a number. She didn't ask about the wages. She worked. They developed a rhythm that was professional and carefully maintained. She worked mornings, he worked the ranch, they intersected briefly at the desk when he needed to sign something, or she had a question about the inventory, and the exchanges were productive and impersonal, and both of them worked to keep them that way. It was a conscious effort, and they both knew it was a conscious effort, and neither of them acknowledged knowing, because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging why. What threatened it, eventually, was not romance or scandal or anything the town gossips were imagining. What threatened it was February. February in Montana has a quality that's hard to explain to people who've never lived through one. It's not just cold. Cold is a condition, and you can manage conditions. February is cold that has been going on for a long time and shows no signs of reconsidering. It gets into things, into wood and stone and relationships and the back of your mind. It makes people short-tempered and sharp-edged and prone to saying things they've been sitting on. On a Thursday in the 3rd week of February, Gideon came in from the north fence with a problem that had turned into a bigger problem. A section of fence the snow had weighted down and twisted, cattle that had drifted through the gap, 2 hours of cold work getting them back, and found Clara at his desk going through the feed bills with an expression that said she had found something she didn't like. "These numbers," she said without looking up, "don't match what Hector told me he ordered in November." "Show me," Gideon said, and he was sharper than he meant to be, coming in cold and frustrated and trailing ice from his boots. She showed him. He looked at the figures and he could see the problem. Someone had shorted the delivery and he'd signed off on the receipt without checking it closely enough, which was the kind of thing that happened when you were managing too many things at once. "I should have caught that," he said. "Yes," she said, not unkindly, but directly. He sat down in the other chair and pulled off his wet gloves. He could feel the beginning of a headache from the cold and the 2 hours of fence work and the general accumulated weight of February. "How much?" She told him. It was not a catastrophic number, but it was money he'd been billed for goods he hadn't received. "I'll deal with it," he said. "I can write the letter to the supplier," she said, "if you'd like." "I can write my own letters." A pause. "I know that," she said. Something about the patience in her voice made him aware of his own tone. He pulled off his hat and set it on the desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Sorry," he said. "Rough morning." "I heard you come in," she said. "The fence on the north run?" "Yeah. Dutch mentioned it was weakening last week." "I know. I should have gotten to it sooner." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I know." There was a brief silence that wasn't quite comfortable, but wasn't hostile either. The silence of two people who were learning each other's edges through proximity and occasional collision. "I'll write the letter to the supplier," he said. "But if you want to draft it first, that's all right." She looked at him for a moment. "I'll draft it," she said. "You can revise." "Fair enough." She went back to the figures, and he went to the kitchen to get warm, and Hector was there with coffee already made, because Hector paid attention to these things. And Gideon sat at the kitchen table with his hands around the cup and listened to the wind outside and the quiet sound of pen on paper from the other room. And February pressed against the windows with its particular indifferent weight, and the coffee was hot. And from somewhere across the yard he could hear Eli's voice, something complicated and high-pitched, some game that required a lot of announcement. And the sound of it was so ordinary and alive against the dead cold outside that Gideon sat with it for a moment and let himself feel it. That was the problem with letting things in gradually. You didn't notice how much had come in until you sat still and felt the warmth of it. The talk in Harlow didn't die down. He'd hoped it might, once the arrangement was clear and professional and visible to anyone who cared to look at it honestly. He had underestimated how little interest certain people had in looking honestly at things that were more interesting as rumors. Cole Granger, who had always had an opinion about everyone else's business, had apparently made the Whitmore situation a regular part of his repertoire at the feed store, the barbershop, and anywhere else he could draw an audience. Gideon heard versions of it secondhand, from Dutch, from the ranch hand called Pepper, who had relatives in town, from Hector, who heard things from the delivery men who came out from Harlow twice a month. The story had evolved, the way stories do when they travel. In the current version, Clara was characterized as a woman who had manipulated a vulnerable man, which told Gideon everything about how Cole Granger saw the world. Because if there was one word that had never attached itself to Gideon Cross in 11 years, it was vulnerable. But fear takes interesting shapes, and sometimes what people couldn't understand they recast as manipulation, because it was more comfortable to blame a woman than to sit with the confusion of a man they thought they knew doing something they hadn't predicted. He let it go. He told himself he was letting it go because engaging with Cole Granger was beneath him, which was true. He told himself he was letting it go because the arrangement spoke for itself, which was also true. He let it go until the day Hector came to him with a different kind of news. "Noah," Hector said, "the Porter boy hit him behind the feed store on Saturday." Gideon looked up from the fence post he was examining. "How bad?" he asked. "Split lip? Bruised ribs, maybe?" "He walked home, so nothing broken." Hector paused. He didn't tell his mother. Of course he hadn't. 10 years old and already carrying things he didn't want to put down in front of her, already trying to be the thing standing between the world and whatever the world meant to do to her. "The Porter boy," Gideon said. "Thomas Porter's kid?" "His oldest, 14, 15, big for his age." Gideon thought about Noah splitting wood with a too-heavy axe, adjusting his grip, making it work. He thought about "they said my mother wasn't decent," said with that set jaw and those steady eyes. "Is Noah all right?" he asked. "He will be," Hector said. "He's tougher than he has any right to be at his age." "I know," Gideon said. He looked out across the cold yard. The wind had picked up again, coming down hard from the northwest, and the light was the flat gray light of late February that made everything look like it was waiting for something. He thought about what he'd told Noah, the person doing the talking. If they matter to you, then what they say matters. He thought about whether he'd meant that, or whether he'd just been saying the practical thing. He thought about 11 words in a letter and 8 years of silence, and the careful walls he'd built, and the drawings in the desk drawer, and the sound of coffee being made in a kitchen that had been quiet for a long time. He was starting to understand that what he'd told himself about letting it go had limits, that there were things you could let go of, and things you couldn't. And the difference had to do with what you actually valued and what you were just choosing not to fight for because fighting was hard and the outcome wasn't guaranteed. He hadn't fought for anything in 8 years, He'd worked hard and kept his head down and managed his land and kept his walls in good repair and called it living, because it looked enough like living that nobody pushed back on the description. He was starting to think that description might have been approximately as accurate as that note had been, which was to say, true in the most minimal and inadequate sense, technically correct, practically empty. Clara found him at the barn that evening after supper, which was unusual. She normally went back to the cabin with the children after the workday was done, maintaining the boundary that kept the arrangement clean. She stood in the barn doorway, and he could see from her face that she knew about Noah. "He told you," he said. "Hector told me," she said. "When I asked why Noah was moving carefully." Gideon nodded. He went back to what he'd been doing with the harness and then stopped, because it seemed wrong to pretend to be occupied when she was standing in the doorway with that look on her face. "This is my fault," she said. "No," he said. "It's Cole Granger's fault and Thomas Porter's bad parenting." She shook her head. "I made the choice to come here. I knew what the talk was." "You made the choice to keep your children warm and fed," he said. "Those are not the same thing as causing this." She looked at him. In the lamplight of the barn, her face was tired and real, without the careful containment she usually wore like a second coat. She was just a woman who was worn through, and she wasn't trying to hide it in this particular moment, and that undefended look did something to him that he was completely unequipped to handle. "I don't know if this is working," she said. Not helplessly. Clara Whitmore didn't do helpless. But honestly. The way she did everything honest, straight at you, without decoration. "It's working," he said. "They hit my son." "I know." He set down the harness. "I'm going to deal with that." I don't want—" "Not the way you're thinking," he said. "I'm not going to start a fight over it, but I'm going to deal with it." She looked at him for a long moment. "How?" she asked. He thought about it. He thought about what actually moved people in a place like Harlow, what made the Cole Grangers of the world revise their calculations. It wasn't arguments. It wasn't confrontation in an alley. It was standing. It was the visible, unmistakable weight of a man saying, "This is where I put myself, and here is what I'm willing to have that mean." "Visibly," he said. Clara tilted her head slightly. "The spring fair," he said. "It's 3 weeks out. People come from every property in the valley. I'm going to be there, and you're going to be there, and the children are going to be there, and I'm going to stand next to you in front of every person in this valley who has anything to say about it." Clara was very still. "That will make it worse before it makes it better," she said. "Probably," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. Something shifted in her face. Not softening exactly, more like a door opening slightly on something she wasn't entirely sure about yet. "Why?" she asked. Not sharply, genuinely. He thought about it honestly, the way he'd been trying to do more of lately. "Because it's right," he said. "And because I'm tired of letting things go that I shouldn't be letting go." She stood in the doorway for another moment. The wind moved outside and the lamp swung slightly, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and Gideon stood in the middle of his barn in February and waited to see what she would decide. "All right," she said finally. She turned and walked back across the yard toward the cabin, and through the barn door he could see the light come on inside, warm and steady, against the cold dark of the Montana night. He stood there for a while after she'd gone. The horses were quiet. The wind was not. Outside, February kept pressing down on everything, heavy and indifferent, the way it had been doing for weeks. But it had limits. He knew that. February always had limits. It just didn't advertise them. 3 weeks to the spring fair. He went back to the harness and finished what he'd been doing, working steadily in the lamplight until the job was done. The spring fair came to Harlow on a Saturday in mid-March, when the snow had pulled back from the lower fields but still held the high ground, and the mud season was making its usual argument about whether winter was actually over yet. It was the kind of day that couldn't quite commit to itself. Cold in the shade, almost warm in the sun, the sky doing something complicated with clouds that never fully resolved into rain or clear. The whole valley came in for the fair regardless of weather, the way they had for as long as anyone could remember, because in a place where your nearest neighbor might be 6 miles off and a trip to town was an event requiring planning, any occasion that put everyone in the same place at the same time was something you didn't pass up. People came from ranches and homesteads, and the 2 small mining operations up in the northern hills came in wagons and on horseback and on foot, and by 10 in the morning, Harlow's main street had more people on it than it would see again until the 4th of July. Gideon rode in early. He'd told Clara to meet him at the fairground entrance at 9:30, and she'd said she would be there, and he had not doubted that she would because Clara Whitmore said what she meant and did what she said. He tied his horse at the rail in front of the hardware store and walked the length of the street once, taking stock of who was there and where. Not because he was nervous exactly, but because he was a man who liked to understand the landscape before he committed to a position in it. He saw Cole Granger near the blacksmith's, already holding court with two men Gideon didn't recognize, gesturing with the expansive confidence of someone who expected to be agreed with. He saw Agnes Pierce at the dry goods table, talking to two other women who kept glancing toward the fairground entrance with the attentive anticipation of people who had heard something was going to happen. He saw Thomas Porter and his wife near the livestock pen, which put their son somewhere in the vicinity, and he noted that without planning what to do about it and moved on. He was at the entrance at 9:20. Clara arrived at 8:28, which he calculated meant she'd been waiting somewhere out of sight rather than arrive first and stand there alone. She came with all 4 children, Noah walking beside her, Eli running slightly ahead and being reined back, June and May holding hands and looking at everything with enormous eyes. Clara herself was wearing her good coat, the dark wool one that wasn't as worn as the other, and her hair was properly up, and she had the look of someone who had dressed carefully not to impress anyone, but to give herself nothing to be self-conscious about. Armor, not vanity. She met his eyes when she saw him. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He offered his arm. It was a deliberate choice, made beforehand, not romantic, or not only romantic, but a public statement legible to everyone watching, which people were. He could feel it without looking around. The specific quality of attention that a crowd has when it's watching something it's been anticipating. Clara looked at his offered arm for about 1 second. Then she took it. They walked into the fairground together, with the children falling into formation around them. And Gideon felt every eye in the vicinity find them and stay. And he walked at a pace that was normal and unhurried and made absolutely clear that he was aware of being watched and did not find it inconvenient. The first few minutes were the hardest, not for him. He'd been the object of people's attention in this valley for 11 years and had learned to find it either useful or irrelevant depending on circumstances. For Clara, he suspected. She walked with her spine straight and her chin level and didn't look at anyone specifically, which was both the right thing to do and clearly cost something. It was Agnes Pierce who broke first. She came toward them from the dry goods table with the kind of speed that indicated she'd decided on an action before she could reconsider it, and she stopped in front of them and looked at Clara directly. "Clara," she said, and then to Gideon, "Mr. Cross." "Agnes," Clara said. "It's good to see you both," Agnes said. She said it simply, without performance, and Gideon understood that Agnes Pierce had made her own decision about what she thought of the situation and had decided to be visible about it, which took more courage than most people gave Agnes Pierce credit for. "Clara, June has gotten tall. Look at her." June, hearing her name, looked up from May's hand with that assessing, practical gaze. "She has," Clara said, and the tension in her arm against his shifted slightly, not disappearing but adjusting to something more manageable. Agnes walked with them for a few minutes, which was its own public statement. Agnes knew everyone in Harlow, and everyone in Harlow knew that. Being seen with Agnes was not quite an endorsement from the whole community, but it was close enough to one to matter. The morning went better than it had any right to, not without cost. Cole Granger crossed their path once, deliberately, and looked at Gideon with the expression of a man recalculating. He didn't say anything. Gideon looked back at him with the specific stillness he'd developed over years of dealing with men who mistook loud for strong, and Granger moved on. 2 of the women who'd been whispering near the dry goods table turned away when Clara looked toward them, which was its own answer to its own question. Thomas Porter watched from across the livestock pen with something on his face that might have been reassessment. But the children ran the fairground. That was the thing. Eli, freed from the restraint of the walk-in, discovered that there were other children, and that some of them had dogs, and that there was a contest involving sacks near the far fence, and he was gone. June found a girl her age near the quilting display, and they began a conversation of the specific and immediate depth that only 7-year-olds can achieve with strangers. May stayed close to Clara for the first hour, and then began to venture slightly further in concentric circles, the way small children test the perimeter when they're starting to feel safe. Noah drifted, watching everything, occasionally glancing back to locate Clara and Gideon with the habit of someone who has taken on the job of keeping track. At one point, midday, Gideon found himself standing with Noah near the cattle pen while Clara sat with Agnes Pierce and 2 other women at the quilting tables. And May had fallen asleep against Clara's leg, and the afternoon light had found a gap in the clouds and was doing something almost warm with it. "You were right," Noah said. Gideon looked at him. "About what?" "About standing here." Noah was looking at his mother, at the circle of women around her, at the ordinary, unremarkable picture of her sitting and talking like a woman who belonged where she was. "I thought it would be worse." "It might get worse yet," Gideon said honestly. "Today was one day." "I know," Noah said, "but today happened." Gideon looked at him. At this boy who was 10 years old and had already learned to count individual good days as distinct and important things, not to be dismissed just because tomorrow was uncertain. There was something in that he recognized from a long way back, from before he'd stopped counting good days because counting them made it hurt more when they ended. "Yes," he said, "it did." The ride home in the late afternoon was quiet in a good way, the children exhausted and talking slower, Eli falling asleep in the wagon before they'd gone a mile, June recounting the entire day's events to May in the particular narrative style of a child who has processed something and needs to say it out loud to make it real. Clara drove the wagon and Gideon rode alongside, and they didn't talk much, but the silence was companionable rather than careful, which was new. "Thank you," she said, when they turned onto the property road. "You did the hard part," he said. She shook her head slightly. "We both know that's not entirely true." He didn't argue it. At the cabin, he helped carry the sleeping Eli inside, while Dutch, who'd stayed behind to manage the ranch, took the wagon horse. Noah carried May without being asked. Clara got the fire built up fast, the way she always did, efficient and without fuss. And within 20 minutes, the cabin was warm and the children were in various states of settled, and the day was wrapping itself up the way good days do. Not with a conclusion exactly, just a gradual tapering into quiet. Gideon was at the cabin door, heading back to the main house, when Clara said his name. "Gideon." He turned. She was standing by the fire, her coat off, her hair coming loose from the day, and she looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not the careful, managed face she usually wore, not the tired face from the barn in February. Something that was just her, unedited, looking at him across the warm room. "I know what today cost you," she said, "with certain people." "It didn't cost me anything I wanted to keep," he said. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded once, and he went out into the evening air and walked back across the yard to the main house, and the stars were coming out over the mountains, and it was still cold, but the cold was different now. Temporary, retreating, the cold of a season that was losing its argument with the calendar. He was halfway across the yard when he heard it. Smelled it first, actually. Smoke. Not the ordinary wood smoke smell of fires and stoves. Something sharper, more chemical. The particular smell of something burning that wasn't meant to burn. He turned. The shed behind the cabin, the small storage structure that had come with the foreman's quarters where they kept the extra firewood and winter supplies, was on fire. Not smoldering. Fully. Fast. With an appetite that said it hadn't started 10 seconds ago, but had been working itself up for long enough to get a proper hold. His mind went through the calculation before he'd finished turning. The shed was close to the cabin's back wall, close enough that if the wind shifted even slightly, the cabin itself would catch, and the wind was doing what Montana wind always did, which was anything it pleased. He was running before the thought completed itself. "Fire!" he shouted, and then louder toward the bunkhouse. "Dutch! Fire at the cabin!" He hit the cabin door at a run and didn't knock. Clara was already at the window, already seeing it, her face gone the specific white of someone whose mind has jumped to every consequence at once. "The children," he said. "Get them out now. All 4. Go north toward the big barn, and don't stop." "Noah," she started. "I'll get Noah. Go." She went. That was the thing about Clara. She thought fast and moved fast and didn't waste time on arguments when arguments were the wrong tool. She had May in her arms and Eli by the hand in 15 seconds, and she was out the front door and moving north, calling June's name, her voice steady enough to keep the children from full panic. Noah was in the back room. He'd come to the window and seen it and was already pulling on his boots when Gideon got to the doorway. "Come on," Gideon said. "Now. I need to get you." "Now, Noah." The boy came. They went out the front and north, and Gideon could see the shed fully now. The whole back wall gone, the roof starting to catch, and the wind had made its decision and was pushing south toward the cabin, and he could already see the first dark spots appearing on the cabin's back wall, where embers were landing and finding purchase. Dutch came at a run from the bunkhouse with two of the other hands, and Hector was behind them with a bucket, and Gideon did the math in his head and knew it wasn't enough. "The cabin wall," he said to Dutch. "Wet it down, all of it. Keep wetting it. Don't let up." Dutch nodded and was already turning. Gideon went back toward the fire. He wasn't being heroic about it. He was being practical, which is what he did when he was frightened, because fear directed at a useful purpose was survivable, and fear directed at nothing in particular was not. The shed was gone. He knew that, accepted it, moved on. What mattered was the cabin wall and what was inside the cabin, and he thought through what was inside the cabin. The children's bedding, their clothing, the cooking things Clara had brought from Indiana, and the drawings. The stack of drawings wrapped in cloth that she'd taken from the old shelter's wall and moved here and put on the shelf above the small table. He knew, going in, that the drawings were not the most important thing. He went in anyway. The back of the cabin was already hot, the rear wall conducting heat from the shed fire through the logs, and the air inside had the dense quality of a space that was warming too fast. He moved through it quickly, not letting himself assess the heat against his skin in detail, grabbed the wrapped drawings from the shelf and the cooking pot and the box of Clara's good things from the shelf beside the stove, and went back out the front door. He put things down in the yard and went back. He wasn't sure afterward what he was thinking on the second trip in. He'd gotten what was irreplaceable. The drawings were Clara's, the cooking things were Clara's. Those were the things that couldn't be replaced. But he went back in, and he got the bedding and the children's clothing, armload by armload, and he was carrying the last of it out when the back wall of the cabin buckled with a sound like a fist hitting something solid, and the heat came through the gap, sudden and total. He made it out the front door. He wasn't sure his coat had survived it intact. He set the last of the bedding down in the yard, and Dutch was there beside him immediately, and Hector was there. And across the yard, Clara was coming back toward him with May still on her hip, and her face doing something he'd never seen it do before, which was coming apart slightly at the seams. She got to him and stopped 3 feet away and looked at him. "Are you—" she started. "I'm fine," he said. She looked at his coat. He looked down at his coat. There was a burned patch along the left sleeve and shoulder that was more extensive than he'd realized, and the smell coming off it was not a good smell, and his left hand, when he looked at it, had burns across the back that he was only beginning to feel because his body had been sensible enough to defer the pain until the running was done. "That's not fine," Claire said. "It will be," he said. Dutch and Pepper, on the other hand, had the cabin wall wet enough now that it wasn't catching, and the shed was a lost cause but burning itself out in a way that, without the wind's intervention, wasn't going to spread further. The barn was safe, the bunkhouse was safe. The cabin had lost its back wall, but the structure was standing and savable. Noah appeared at his elbow. "The drawings," the boy said. He was looking at the cloth-wrapped stack in the yard. "Got them," Gideon said. Noah looked at them, looked at Gideon's burned sleeve, did the math. His face went through something complicated that he was working very hard to keep controlled, and Gideon recognized that effort from the inside of it, having performed it himself many times over many years, and understood that the appropriate response was to not make a thing of it. "Good," Noah said after a moment. His voice was steady. "Good." June, who had been holding Clara's hand, let go and came to Gideon, and without any warning put her arms around his middle and pressed her face against his burned coat, and the pain of it was sharp and real, and he stood very still and put his unburned hand on the back of her head, very gently. "It's all right," he said. "Everything's all right." The burns were not minor. He understood this more clearly over the following hour, as the adrenaline finished leaving his body and the pain arrived properly to fill the space it left. His left hand was the worst, the back of it and the first two fingers, where he'd been carrying the last loadout and hadn't gotten his coat sleeve down in time. His left shoulder had a burn beneath the ruined coat that he couldn't see but could feel with a precision that left no ambiguity about its extent. Clara saw his face when he moved the coat and came over without asking permission. "Sit down," she said. "I need to—" "Sit down, Gideon." He sat down on the overturned crate that Hector had produced from somewhere, and Clara knelt beside him and looked at his hand in the lamplight Dutch had brought out, and her face was composed and practical, and she didn't say anything about what she was seeing, but he could read from the set of her mouth that she was not happy with what she was seeing. "You went back in," she said. "Yes." "More than once." It wasn't a question, so he didn't answer it. "Hector," she said, standing, "I need clean water and whatever medical supplies you have. Cloth. Clean cloth." Hector was already moving. She worked on his hand with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything, cleaning it carefully, methodically, not fast, not slow, with exactly as much pressure as was necessary, and not more. It hurt. He didn't say so. He sat on the crate in the cold air with the shed still smoking to the south, and his ranch hands managing the aftermath, and Clara Whitmore's hands working over his with a steadiness that told him she had done this kind of thing before and had learned to set herself aside and do what the situation needed. "You got the drawings," she said. She wasn't looking at his face, she was looking at his hand. "Yes." "You didn't have to go back for those." "I know." A pause in which she pressed something against the worst of the burn, and he managed not to make a sound. "I know you know," she said quietly. "I know that." The children were close by, May asleep in June's lap somehow, Eli standing very still watching Gideon's hand with a look on his face that suggested he was old enough to understand that something serious had happened, but young enough not to know exactly how serious. Noah stood at the edge of the lamplight, not looking at Gideon's hand, looking at the ruined shed, and Gideon could see him from the corner of his eye, working through something in that methodical way he had of processing things. "We'll move you into the main house tonight," Clara said. "You can't tend to this yourself." He started to object. She looked up at him, and the look was the specific look of a woman who had exhausted her tolerance for arguments about what the situation required. "All right," he said. "I'll sit with you, to make sure the burns don't go bad overnight." "You don't need to—" "Gideon." She said his name the way you say something when you need it to be the last word. "Be quiet." He was quiet. But the fire's origin became clear in the morning. Dutch found it when he went through the shed's remains with Pepper in daylight, a corner of the storage area where they'd kept spare oil for the lanterns, near the exterior wall. The cans were intact, which ruled out an accident with the oil itself, but the boards near them were burned in a pattern that Dutch, who had seen a few things in his time, described to Gideon as deliberate. "Someone put a fire to it," Dutch said. "Probably rags and coal oil, applied from outside through the gap in the baseboards. Fire went up fast and internal, which is why we didn't see it start." Gideon lay in his own bed with his left hand wrapped and elevated because Claire had told him to keep it elevated, and Dutch stood in the doorway telling him this in the measured tone of a man who was angry and keeping it well under control. "Anyone see anything?" Gideon asked. "Not before. Pepper says he heard a horse on the road at dusk, but thought nothing of it." Gideon stared at the ceiling. "It was meant to frighten," he said. "If it was meant to do real harm, there were easier targets than the storage shed." "Maybe," Dutch said, "or maybe they misjudged how fast it would spread to the cabin." Either possibility was coherent. Gideon sat with both of them. "Say nothing to anyone in town yet," he said. "I want to think about how to handle this." Dutch nodded and left. Gideon heard him in the hallway speaking briefly with Clara, too quiet to make out the words, and then Dutch's boots on the stairs going down. Clara appeared in the doorway. She'd been up most of the night, tending his hand through the hours when infection was the real concern, and she looked tired in the particular way of someone who has spent long hours holding something together by force of will. She was still in yesterday's clothes. She had not, he suspected, let herself stop long enough to change. "Dutch told me," she said. "I know." She came in and checked his hand without sitting down. lifting the cloth, looking at what was underneath, replacing it. Her hands were gentle and certain, and she didn't make a production of any of it. "This is because of me," she said. "This is because someone is a coward who starts fires in the dark instead of saying what they mean in daylight," he said. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. She didn't argue with him, which wasn't the same as agreeing. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the window and the morning light coming through it, and he looked at her profile, the tiredness in it, the contained anger, the particular set of her mouth that meant she was thinking through something to its conclusion, whether or not she liked where it led. "You could have died," she said. Not melodramatically, just as a fact, calmly stated, the way she stated facts. "I could have," he said. "I don't want that on my account." "It's not on your account," he said. "It's on mine. I made the choices. You don't get to take responsibility for my choices any more than I get to take responsibility for yours." She looked at him then. He thought she might be about to argue, because she was not a woman who capitulated easily to any proposition, reasonable or otherwise. But she looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her face, not the careful composure giving way exactly, but something underneath it becoming visible. "You're a stubborn man," she said. "I've been told that." "By who?" "Mostly by people who were trying to get me to do something I didn't want to do," he said. "So I tend to take it as a point in my favor." Something crossed her face. It might have been the beginning of a smile, if she'd let it get all the way there. She didn't quite let it, but it was close. "How does it feel?" she asked, meaning his hand. "Like I put it in a fire," he said. "That's going to be the answer for a while," she said. "The skin needs to close before it stops hurting the way it's hurting." "I know." She stood and smoothed her coat. "I'm going to get the children settled and then I'm coming back." "You don't have to stay." "I'm coming back," she said, in the tone that ended discussions. She went out and he lay in the quiet of his own room with his hand elevated and the morning light moving across the wall and thought about a 10-year-old boy adjusting his grip on a too-heavy axe, and a woman who ate last and drawings of a round-bodied horse, and about who in this valley had the particular combination of cowardice and cruelty to start a fire in the dark. He had ideas. He didn't have proof yet, but he had ideas. He was well enough to sit up by the following afternoon, and well enough to be irritating about it, which Clara said was a reliable sign of recovery. She was at the small desk he'd moved into the room so she could keep working on the accounts while she kept an eye on him, which he recognized as a practical solution, but which also required him to be in the same room as her for several hours at a stretch, which had a quality he wasn't sure how to account for. "The supplier billing," she said, without looking up from the ledger. "The one from November. I wrote the letter. Do you want to review it before I send it?" "I trust your letter," he said. "You should read it anyway. It's your name on it." He held out his good hand. She brought the letter over and stood beside the bed while he read it. It was exactly right. Precise, documented, not aggressive but absolutely clear about what had been billed, what had been received, and what correction was expected. He couldn't have written it better himself, and he was honest enough to know it. "Send it," he said. She took it back to the desk. He watched her sit down and pick up the pen and thought about the way she moved through a room, not taking up space unnecessarily, never performing anything, just doing what the moment required and setting aside what it didn't. He thought about what it must have cost her to come to this valley, to follow a man who'd told her he could build something and watch it fail slowly, to bury him in unfamiliar ground, to keep 4 children alive through a Montana winter in a collapsing shelter on grit and stubbornness, and the willingness to let a stranger leave food on the back step without surrendering anything that mattered. "Clara," he said. She looked up from the desk. "Who taught you the accounts?" he asked. Something in her expression shifted, not guarded, more like surprised. "My father, he ran a dry goods store in Indianapolis. I worked the books from the time I was 12. "Why did you come west?" She looked at him for a moment. It was a personal question, and they hadn't been in the habit of personal questions, and he waited to see whether she'd answer it. "James Whitmore came east looking for investors for his homestead," she said. "He was charming, and he was certain, and I thought certain men knew something I didn't." A pause. "I've since revised that view." "Did you love him?" he asked. It was more personal than the first question, and he wasn't sure why he was asking except that he wanted to understand the full shape of what she'd been through, not just the outline. She considered it seriously. I thought I did. When we married. Another pause. By the end, I think I mostly felt sorry for him. He knew he'd failed and he couldn't bear it. And there was nothing I could do about either of those things. She set down the pen. I stopped being angry at him the year after he died. You can't maintain anger at someone who's not there to be angry at. It just becomes weight. He thought about that, about the specific work of setting down anger at someone who was gone. How you did it not because they deserved it, but because you needed your hands free for other things. The woman who left, she said quietly. You've never told me what happened. He hadn't told anyone what had happened. He hadn't talked about it, not the details, not to Dutch or Hector or anyone. He had carried it inside the walls he'd built and left it there and gone about his work. He looked at the morning light on the wall. He looked at his wrapped hand. Her name was Margaret, he said. She left in the winter of 1881. She left a note. He said it simply, without decoration. 11 words. She'd met someone in Helena. Richer, easier life. He stopped. The part I couldn't forgive for a long time was that I hadn't seen it. I thought I knew her, and I didn't. And after that, I decided the knowing of people was something I wasn't equipped for, so I stopped trying. Clara was quiet for a moment. You saw Noah, she said. The first night. You saw what he was doing and what it meant. He hadn't thought of it that way. That's different, he said. Is it? She picked the pen back up. You knew what he needed before you knew him. You knew what I was before I'd said 10 words to you. She said it matter-of-factly, without sentiment. You see people clearly, Gideon. You just decided the scene would hurt you, so you stopped believing what you saw. He lay in his bed with his burned hand elevated and sat with that for a long time. She went back to the accounts. The pen moved across the ledger with its small, precise scratching. Outside the window, the yard was quiet, and somewhere beyond it the ruined shed sat in its cold ashes, and Dutch and Pepper were somewhere doing what needed to be done, and the horses were in the barn, and the mountains were where they'd always been. He thought about Margaret's 11 words and 8 years of walls, and the particular economy of someone who'd stopped spending on things that hurt and called it prudence. He thought about Clara saying, you see people clearly, Gideon with the same flat certainty she applied to everything she believed, and about whether a person could wall off something for 8 years and then just decide to stop. He didn't know the answer to that. He suspected the answer wasn't a decision exactly. He suspected it was more like the ground thawing. Not something you did, just something that happened when conditions changed, slow and unglamorous and largely against your will. Cole Granger came to the ranch 3 days later. Gideon was up by then, moving around, keeping his left hand out of anything requiring grip. He was in the yard when Granger's wagon came up the road, and he stood and watched it come with his hands in his pockets and waited. Granger was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been red for so long it had become his permanent color. He climbed down from the wagon with the slightly theatrical deliberateness of a man who was either nervous or wanted to appear the opposite of nervous, and he stopped about 10 feet from Gideon. "Cross," he said. "Granger," Gideon said. A pause in which they both took stock of each other, the way men do when they're deciding what kind of conversation this is going to be. "Heard about your fire," Granger said. "Did you?" Gideon said. It wasn't quite a question. "Damn shame." Granger's eyes moved to Gideon's wrapped hand and away. I thought it was right to come and—" He stopped, started again. "People have been talking." "I know they have," Gideon said. "I may have—" Granger cleared his throat. "Some of what got said, I may have passed along more than was warranted." Gideon looked at him. Waited. "The Whitmore woman," Granger said, and there was something in the way he said it, not quite apologetic, not quite defensive, finding an uneasy middle ground. "I didn't know the full of it. What you were doing for them." "You didn't ask," Gideon said. "You heard something that made an interesting story, and you told it." Granger's color deepened. "That's fair," he said, in the tone of a man who finds fair deeply uncomfortable. "The fire," Gideon said. "You have any idea who might have thought that was a reasonable action?" Granger looked at him sharply. You think it was deliberate? Dutch thinks it was deliberate. Dutch has seen deliberate fires before. Granger's color went from red to something closer to purple. I said things, Cross. I know I said things, but I would never. He stopped, pulled in a breath. I don't know who did it. I don't. But if I hear anything, you'll tell me, Gideon said. I'll tell you, Granger said. They stood in the yard for another moment. Your hand, Granger said. The burns, are they… Will you… I'll keep the hand, Gideon said. The fingers will probably work fine, in time. Granger nodded. He looked at the ground and then back up, and there was something in his face that was not quite shame, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has seen the downstream consequence of his own talk and doesn't entirely like what he's seeing. I'm sorry, Granger said. For the talk. I'm sorry for it. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. He thought about what it cost a man like Cole Granger to say that, standing in someone else's yard, hat in hand, with burned evidence on the man in front of him. All right, he said. Granger climbed back up to his wagon. At the top he paused and looked down at Gideon. She seems like good people, he said. The Whitmore woman, from what I've seen. She is, Gideon said. Granger nodded once and drove away. Gideon watched the wagon go down the road and turned back to the yard and found Noah standing at the corner of the bunkhouse, watching. Who was that? Noah asked. A man reconsidering some things, Gideon said. Noah thought about this with his usual thoroughness. Good, he said, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. Gideon stood in the yard in the thin March sunlight and looked at the mountains, which were still half white above the tree line, and at the ruined shed which was going to need clearing before he could begin rebuilding it, and at the cabin's back wall which Dutch had temporarily patched, and which needed real work before it would be right again. There was a great deal of work to be done. That was familiar. That was almost comforting. But it was different work than he'd been doing for 8 years. He could feel the difference, even if he couldn't have said precisely where it lived. It was work with something on the other side of it, not just the maintenance of what existed, but the building of something that hadn't been there before, something that would need tending and repairing, and occasionally defending. He had just done that. He had stood in front of a whole valley and defended it. He had gone into a burning building twice to protect what was inside it. He had sat in a chair in his own bedroom and told someone something true about himself that he'd carried alone for 8 years, and the world had not ended. He put his good hand in his coat pocket and felt, without looking, the edges of a folded piece of brown paper that he'd taken to carrying there. The quiet rider, June's round-bodied horse, and the figure in the hat. He stood in the March sunlight and let himself feel the weight of it, not the pain, which was there and real, and would be for some time, but the other thing underneath the pain. The thing he'd been calling by different names for months, trying to give it a name small enough that he didn't have to account for it. He was done doing that. He went inside to see how his hand felt, and whether Claire was still at the desk. And when he came through the door, she was, her head bent over the ledger, pen moving in that small, precise way, and she looked up when he came in, and he held her eyes for just a moment. Long enough to let something true be visible in his face without explaining it, and then he went to the kitchen to see if Hector had made coffee. He had. He always did. Some things Gideon thought you could count on. The hand healed slowly, which Gideon found instructive. He was not a patient man by nature. He was efficient, methodical, capable of sustained effort over long periods. But patience, the kind that required you to simply wait for something to happen at its own pace without being able to push it, had never come easily to him. He had managed it with the ranch by staying busy with other things while he waited for cattle prices or weather or grass to do what they were going to do, regardless of his preferences. He had managed it for 8 years with his own interior life by not having one. But the hand was right in front of him, always. And there was no pretending it wasn't there and no work he could redirect himself to that didn't eventually run into its limits. And so he was left, for the first time in a long time, in genuine proximity to something he couldn't manage by effort alone. Clara changed the dressings every morning. She did it in the kitchen, at the table, with the light from the east window coming in clean and cold while the stove worked at taking the chill off the room. She had a system, the same sequence every time. Warm water first, then the careful removal of the old cloth, then the assessment, then the cleaning, Then the new dressing applied with a specific tension that she'd worked out over the first several days. She didn't narrate what she was doing. She didn't ask him how it felt, because they both knew how it felt, and naming it didn't help it. She just did it, with those steady hands, in the morning light. He sat across from her each morning and let her, which was its own kind of concession for a man who had spent 8 years being the only person responsible for himself. The burns on his hand were healing in layers, which Clara explained to him with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who'd had to learn things about wounds because there was no one else to learn them. The surface would look better before the deeper tissue was ready. The itching meant repair was happening. The tightness that would probably remain was the skin compensating for what it had lost. She told him this not to comfort him, but because she thought he'd rather know the mechanics of a thing than be managed around them, which was accurate. "You've done this before," he said one morning, watching her work. "Tended burns." "James?" she said, without looking up. "He was careless with the stove in the first winter. Arm and hand. Not as bad as yours, but bad enough." She kept working. "There was no doctor within 40 miles. You learn." He thought about that. About a woman 20-some years old in a collapsing shelter 40 miles from a doctor, learning how to tend a burn because the alternative was to not know. About the specific kind of competence that comes from being in situations where incompetence has real consequences, and there's nobody else to hand the problem to. "What did you do when he died?" he asked. It came out more directly than he'd intended, but she didn't flinch at it. "I sat with him until it was done," she said. "Then I got up and told Noah." She paused for just a moment, a pause he wouldn't have caught if he hadn't been watching carefully. He was 8. He already knew something was wrong. He'd known for weeks. And after. She pressed a fold of cloth gently against the worst of the scarring. "After I wrote a letter to my father. I had enough money for stamps, and not much else. I told him where I was and what had happened and asked if he could send anything he could spare." She stopped. "He sent $30 and a letter that said he'd told me so." Gideon looked at her. She said it without self-pity, without performance, the way she said all the hard things, directly, because there was no point in being indirect about what was true. $30, he said. "It bought 2 months, she said, and by then I'd found work at the Morrison farm mending and laundry. It wasn't enough, not nearly, but it kept us going until winter." She tied off the fresh dressing and sat back. "I wasn't going to write him again. I decided that when I read his letter, I had enough things weighing on me without adding his satisfaction about it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You've been carrying this whole thing alone," he said. "I had Noah," she said simply. "He's 10. He was 8 when it started. He's been 10 for a few months." Something moved across her face. "He shouldn't have had to grow up that fast, I know that. I couldn't stop it." She stood and began gathering the used cloths in the water basin and putting things back in order the way she always did. No mess left behind. Everything in its place. He watched her move through the kitchen and thought about what 8 years of silence had looked like from the inside and what 2 years of keeping 4 children alive alone had looked like from the inside, and thought that the 2 of them had been doing roughly the same thing, walling off the part of themselves that needed tending because there was nobody they trusted to tend it, and the alternative was coming apart, and the work still needed doing. "Clara," he said. She turned with the basin in her hands. "I'm glad you're here," he said. It came out plainly, without qualification, which surprised him slightly because he hadn't planned it exactly. He'd been thinking it for weeks in various forms, and avoiding saying it for reasons that were starting to seem less compelling than they had. She looked at him. She held the basin and she looked at him with those careful, clear eyes, and for once she didn't immediately reach for the composed expression she usually kept ready. "I know," she said quietly. Then she turned and went to the sink, and he let it be what it was. It was Eli who found the evidence. Eli was 6 and operated largely on instinct and curiosity, which was a combination that led him into places he probably shouldn't be and occasionally produced results that couldn't have been achieved by any more methodical approach. He'd been exploring the creek bank south of the cabin. He'd been told not to go near the creek, and had been told this multiple times, and had developed a creative interpretation of what near meant that satisfied his conscience without technically altering his behavior. When he found a piece of cloth snagged on a low branch about 30 yards upstream from where the ruined shed had stood, He brought it to Noah because Noah was who you brought things to when you found them and weren't sure what they were. Noah looked at it. He brought it to Clara. Clara looked at it and then looked at Dutch, who happened to be repairing the fence line near the cabin and who came and looked at it when Clara called him over. Dutch held it in 2 fingers and turned it in the light. "Coal oil," he said. "Smell it." Clara smelled it. She looked at Dutch and then at Noah, and then she took the cloth to Gideon. He was at his desk, working through the ledger one-handed with somewhat less speed than usual, when she came in and set the cloth on the desk without explaining it, and waited. He looked at it, picked it up, smelled it. "Where did Eli find it?" he asked. "Creek bank, south side." He thought about the geography of it, the direction someone would come from if they were approaching the property from town and didn't want to use the main road. The creek bank ran south along the property's edge, and 30 yards upstream from the shed's south wall was exactly the right position for someone to have crouched in the dark with their materials and waited for the right moment. "Eli," he said. "Where exactly?" "I'll show you," Eli said from the doorway, where he had apparently followed Clara at a careful distance. Gideon looked at the boy. Eli was small and bright-eyed and had the quality of a child who was always slightly ahead of the situation in terms of physical location. And right now, he was looking at Gideon with a 6-year-old's version of serious, which was completely sincere and slightly undermined by the mud on his left boot. "You weren't near the creek," Gideon said. "I wasn't near it," Eli said carefully. "I was along it." "That's different." Gideon looked at Clara. Clara looked at the ceiling briefly, in the specific way of a woman who has had this particular conversation before and understands it's never entirely resolved. "Show me," Gideon said. Eli showed him. The spot was exactly where Gideon had calculated, and there were other things there too, once he was looking. A depression in the mud where someone had knelt, a scuff where a boot had slipped slightly on the bank and caught on a different branch slightly closer to the water, a button. Plain brass, the kind that came on work coats, but with a distinctive flatback that Gideon knew because he'd seen it before. He couldn't have said immediately where, but it was familiar in the specific way of something you've seen regularly without paying attention to it. He pocketed the button. He sent Eli back to the cabin with instructions that were not entirely effective because Eli had already identified 2 more things of interest along the bank and was deeply reluctant to leave them. But Noah appeared and said something quietly to his brother that moved him along, which was useful. Gideon stood on the creek bank alone for a few minutes. He wasn't angry exactly. He'd been angry in the first days after the fire, in the compressed, efficient way that anger works in a man who doesn't perform it, cold and purposeful, aimed at whoever needed to be aimed at. But the anger had done its useful work, and now what he felt was more like clarity. Someone had made a decision about his property and the people on it, and that decision needed consequences, and he was going to find out whose decision it had been and deliver those consequences in whatever form was most appropriate to the situation. The button sat in his coat pocket next to the folded drawing. He walked back to the main house and thought about flat-backed brass buttons, and who in this valley wore them, and by the time he reached the porch, he had a working theory. He rode to Thomas Porter's ranch 2 days later, when his hand was well enough that the ride didn't require all his concentration to manage. Porter's place was 7 miles northeast, a mid-sized operation that ran beef cattle and had been in the valley about as long as Gideon's own ranch. Thomas Porter was not a bad man in the broad sense. He worked hard, paid his debts, showed up when there was communal work to be done. He had opinions about how things should be, and a son who had been raised with the understanding that those opinions were the correct ones. Porter was at the corral when Gideon arrived. He saw Gideon coming and had the look of a man who had been expecting this visit for longer than today. Gideon dismounted. He didn't hurry. He tied his horse and walked to the corral fence and leaned against it and looked at the cattle inside for a moment, the way you do when you're giving someone a chance to speak first and seeing whether they take it. Porter didn't speak first. "Your boy," Gideon said. Porter's jaw tightened. He looked at the cattle. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Yes, you do," Gideon said. He took the button from his coat pocket and held it out. Porter looked at it. Something in his face moved. "Creek bank, south side of my property," along with a knee print in the mud and the smell of coal oil on a piece of rag. Porter looked at the button for a long moment. "He's 15, Porter said. His voice had the particular flattened quality of a man defending something he's already decided he can't fully defend. "He hears things." "He heard things you said," Gideon said. Porter didn't respond to that, which was its own response. "The woman's reputation," Gideon said. "What you said about that. What you let be said. That was your doing, and your son heard it and understood that it gave him permission." He kept his voice level. He wasn't going to shout. Shouting was for men who needed the noise to know they were serious. "There's a 10-year-old boy with bruised ribs from what your son did at the feed store. There are 4 children who spent a night outside in March because of what your son did with a rag and some coal oil." Porter's color had been going since the button. He was now the white of a man who has been sitting with something for days and hasn't been comfortable with what he's been sitting with. "I didn't tell him to do that," Porter said. "No," Gideon said. "You told him the story. He drew his own conclusions about what to do with it." A long silence in which the cattle moved in the corral and the wind came off the mountains to the northwest, and Gideon waited. "What do you want?" Porter asked. "I want your son to come to my ranch and speak to Mrs. Whitmore and her family," Gideon said. "I want him to understand what he did, face to face, to real people. And I want you to stand there when he does it." Porter looked at him. "That's all?" he said, and there was something in it that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite confusion. The expression of a man who had been bracing for worse and wasn't sure how to recalibrate to this. "That's what I want from you," Gideon said. "I'll deal with the legal question of the fire separately if it comes to that. But what I want from you today is that your son understands what he did." Porter looked at the cattle for a long moment. He was thinking about pride, Gideon knew. About what it cost a man to take his son somewhere and make him account for something. About whether the thing being asked was reasonable or whether it was humiliation dressed as reason. He watched Porter work through it. "Saturday," Porter said finally. "I'll bring him Saturday." "I'll be there," Gideon said. He rode home thinking about accountability. What it looked like in a place like this valley, where there were no courts worth speaking of for something like this. Where the machinery of consequence was mostly social and depended on what people were willing to stand up for and what they'd quietly let pass. He didn't love that system. He didn't love that a 15-year-old starting a fire could be addressed with a conversation and a button rather than the weight of something more formal. But he understood that what mattered here wasn't the punishment so much as the education, making real to a boy who had acted on abstraction that there were actual people on the other side of his choices. He understood that lesson because he'd been the one who had to learn it. Saturday came gray and cold, which was March's final argument before spring started winning properly. Thomas Porter arrived at mid-morning with his son, a large-framed boy named Curtis, who carried himself with the specific uncertainty of someone who knows he's in trouble but is still deciding whether to be sorry about why. Gideon met them in the yard and walked them to the cabin. Clara opened the door. She had known they were coming. Gideon had told her on Thursday, and she had not said much about it except to ask what he wanted her to do, and he had said only, "Be there," and she had said she would. She stood in the doorway now, with her hands at her sides, and looked at the boy. Curtis Porter was large for 15 and looked younger for it, in the way that physical development sometimes runs ahead of everything else, and leaves a boy looking mismatched with himself. He looked at Clara and then at the floor near her feet. "Come in," she said. Her voice was even. They came in. Noah was at the table. He looked at Curtis with steady eyes and said nothing. Eli had been sent to play outside with June and May, which he'd accepted with the negotiating spirit of a child who immediately identifies the leverage in being asked to do something. Clara stood in the middle of the room and looked at the boy. "Sit down," she said to all of them. They sat. She remained standing. It was not aggressive, just clear. She was managing this space and this moment on her own terms. "Do you know what happened to my children the night of the fire?" she asked Curtis. Curtis looked at his father. His father looked at the table. "They tell me you do," Clara said. "That you saw the fire from the road." The boy's jaw worked. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "May is 4, Clara said. She was asleep when the fire started. She woke up because I woke her up, pulling her out of bed, and she didn't understand what was happening, and she was frightened." She said it without accusation, just as fact, one thing after another. Eli is 6. He understood enough to know something was very wrong and he couldn't find his boots in the dark, and so he went outside in his socks in March. She paused. I found that out later. He didn't tell me at the time because he didn't want me to worry about his feet. Curtis was looking at the table now. June is 7. She held May for the entire night we spent outside because she knew I was busy with Gideon's injuries, and she made a decision to handle her sister herself. A pause. Noah is 10. You met Noah before, at the feed store. Curtis's color had been going steadily since he walked in. He was now the pale of someone who has been looking at a thing he did from the inside and has now been made to look at it from the outside, and the two views are not the same. I didn't, he started. I know you didn't mean to hurt anyone, Clara said. I believe that. I think you did something foolish and frightening based on things you'd heard without thinking all the way through what those things meant or who they were about. She looked at him steadily. But here are the people it was about. Silence. I'm sorry, Curtis said. It came out rough and uneven, the kind of apology that hasn't been rehearsed enough to be smooth but has enough real weight behind it to land. He looked at Noah. I'm sorry I hit you at the feed store. Noah looked at him for a moment. There was nothing simple in what crossed Noah's face. It was not easy forgiveness, not a child's uncomplicated absolution. He was 10 years old and had been hit by a 15-year-old for reasons that had nothing to do with anything he'd done, and he understood that clearly. All right, Noah said finally, which wasn't I forgive you, but was something true, an acknowledgement that the apology had arrived and had been received, and that what happened next was yet to be determined. It was, Gideon thought, exactly the right response for a 10-year-old to give, and it was very much the response of Clara Whitmore's son. Thomas Porter looked at Gideon from across the room. Gideon looked back at him. After they left, Clara stood in the kitchen for a while, not doing anything in particular. Gideon stood in the doorway. Are you all right? He asked. Yes, she said. Then, I don't know if that helped him. It might not have, Gideon said. It wasn't only for him. She looked at him. It was for Noah, he said, for all of them. So they could see it addressed directly. So they knew it wasn't just something that happened to them that nobody named out loud. She thought about that. She had a way of receiving information that he'd come to recognize. She didn't immediately respond. She let it settle, tested it against what she already thought, and then either agreed or didn't. He appreciated it. Most people filled silence too fast. You've been thinking about this for a while, she said. Since the night of the fire, he said. She looked at him steadily. You think through things, she said. You make decisions carefully, and then you move on them. A pause. James was the opposite. He made decisions quickly, and then spent the rest of the time managing what came from them. I've made my share of fast decisions, Gideon said. The fire, she said, going back in. That was fast, he agreed. That was different, she said. That was... She stopped, started again. That was you. That's what you do when something matters to you. You move toward it. He held her eyes. She looked back at him with those clear, tired, honest eyes, and there was something in the room that had been building for weeks and was currently at the edge of being said directly, and both of them felt it, and neither of them had quite gathered enough to step through it. Clara, he started. The accounts, she said at the same moment. They both stopped. Go ahead, he said. The February accounts are reconciled, she said. I think you should look at them. He knew she was deflecting. He was also, if he was honest with himself, slightly relieved because the thing that needed saying had more weight than either of them were fully prepared for at this exact moment in the kitchen with the morning light coming in and Noah at the table nearby. Some things needed the right moment, and the right moment wasn't always the moment when you'd worked up to it. I'll look at them after supper, he said. Good, she said, and picked up a pot and went back to what she'd been doing, and he went out to see what Dutch needed him for, and the cabin sat in the cold gray morning, and the mountains sat above everything, and the valley went about its business in the way it always did, regardless of what the people in it were working up to. The discovery of who'd supplied Curtis Porter with the coal oil came from Hector, which surprised Gideon and did not surprise Clara. Hector had been in Harlow on a supply run when he'd had a conversation at the dry goods counter with a man named Reuben Axe, who worked for a man named Del Ferro, who was the largest landholder in the southern part of the valley and had been making quiet inquiries about the Cross Ranch property for 2 years. Reuben Axe had been drinking more than was strategic, and what he'd told Hector, not directly, but in the elaborate indirect way of a man who wants credit for knowing something without accepting responsibility for saying it, was that Pharaoh had opinions about the Whitmore situation and had been generous with resources to those who shared them. Hector came back and told Gideon, without editorializing, in the same tone he used for everything. Gideon sat with this for a day. Del Ferro was not someone he'd underestimated, which was the only thing currently in his favor in relation to this information. Pharaoh was 60, patient, and had the kind of money that had been making careful long-term bets on the frontier for 30 years. He hadn't approached Gideon directly about the land. He'd sent intermediaries, always with a reasonable offer, always worded to sound like opportunity rather than pressure. Gideon had declined each time without making an enemy of it. He understood now that Pharaoh had decided to change the approach, using the community's discomfort with the Whitmore situation as a lever, feeding the talk, supplying a foolish boy with materials, pressuring from the outside rather than the inside, was exactly the kind of indirect action that left no clear line of accountability. Pharaoh would never touch a fire himself. He would simply make certain resources were available to people who were already inclined toward a certain action and wait to see what happened. It was, Gideon thought, the worst kind of sophisticated cruelty, the kind that maintains clean hands. He went to see his lawyer in Harlow. Franklin Chi was a small, precise man who had been practicing in the territory for 15 years and who had the quality of a man who had seen most things and had developed an orderly internal taxonomy for them. He listened to Gideon without interruption, made 2 notes on a pad, and then put the pen down and looked at him. "What you have," Franklin said, "is a button, a drunk man's implications, and a 15-year-old who is unlikely to name his supplier even under significant pressure." "I know that," Gideon said. "What you can do," Franklin said, "is document everything meticulously and make very clear that you are documenting it. Men like Pharaoh operate in shadow. Sunlight is their primary enemy." He tapped his pen on the pad. "I'd also suggest filing a formal complaint about the fire as arson. Even if it goes nowhere immediately, it establishes a record." "Do that," Gideon said. "And the land," Franklin said. "Your title is clear? All of it?" "As far as I know." "I'd suggest we verify that completely. Every parcel, every line." Franklin made another note. Pharaoh's approach often begins with identifying irregularities in title and using them as purchase points. If your title is completely clean, his leverage narrows considerably. They spent 2 hours going through the ranch's property records, which Gideon had kept meticulously because he was someone who kept things meticulously, and Franklin found nothing irregular except one boundary notation from 1882 that was ambiguously worded and that they spent another 30 minutes clarifying to everyone's satisfaction. When he rode home in the late afternoon, Gideon felt something settle in him. He had named the problem and begun the work of addressing it through the right channels. And that, the act of moving from the vague dread of an unspecified threat toward the concrete work of countering a specific one, was something he knew how to do. He had spent 11 years learning how to manage his land, which meant managing the things that threatened it, and while Del Ferro was a more sophisticated problem than bad fencing or a dry summer, the principle was the same: assess, plan, act. He told Clara that evening. He told her all of it: Hector's information, Franklin's advice, the title review, the arson complaint. He sat across from her at the kitchen table after supper with the children in the other room and went through it the way he'd go through a ranch problem, laying out what was known and what was suspected and what the plan was. She listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions when he was done, both sharp, both about the title review, and when he answered them, she sat back and was quiet for a moment. "He wanted you destabilized," she said. "Pharaoh. He thought if there was enough trouble around the property, enough community friction, enough difficulty, you might decide it wasn't worth the fight." "That's my read," Gideon said, "and instead you filed an arson complaint and cleaned your title." Something crossed her face. "He miscalculated." "He's not done," Gideon said. "I want to be clear about that. This isn't resolved." "I know," she said. But he miscalculated what kind of man he was dealing with. She said it as a statement of fact, not as flattery, and because of that it landed differently than flattery would have. And he doesn't know yet what he's dealing with from my end. Gideon looked at her. I can keep books, she said, and I know how to read a ledger for what's not in it as well as what is. If Pharaoh has been operating in this valley for 30 years, there are paper trails. She looked at him steadily. Let me look. He held her eyes. He thought about her at the desk in the small room, pen moving in that precise way, finding the billing errors he'd missed, the corrections he hadn't caught. All right, he said. She nodded and stood and started clearing the table, and Noah appeared from the other room to help the way he usually did at this hour. And Eli appeared behind Noah and immediately started a project involving the leftover bread that required more explanation than it was worth. And the kitchen was full and warm and complicated and real. Gideon sat at the table while the ordinary business of the evening moved around him and thought about Del Pharaoh, alone on his large southern property with his patient money and his clean hands, and thought that Pharaoh had made several errors. He'd assumed the Cross Ranch was just land and cattle. He'd assumed the woman living on it was a vulnerability. He'd assumed the man who owned it was isolated. None of those things were true anymore. Spring came in stages, the way it always did in Montana, tentative at first, 2 warm days followed by a cold week. Snow on the high ground retreating by inches while the lower fields found their color again, green pushing up through last year's dead grass in the particular insistent way of things that have been waiting a long time. Gideon's hand healed, not perfectly. There was tightness along the back of it that Franklin told him would probably always be there, and cold days made it ache in ways that were a permanent addition to his experience of winter. But the fingers worked. He'd been told they might not in the first week, and they did, and that was enough. He was at the corral on a Tuesday in late March when Clara came to find him. He knew from her pace that something had happened. Not a crisis. Her pace in a crisis was different, faster, and more contained. This was something else, something she was carrying with purpose, and when she got to the fence, she handed him a piece of paper without preamble. It was a letter. The handwriting was Pharaoh's, but he recognized it from the correspondence he'd received through intermediaries. It was addressed to him and had come through the Harlow post office. He read it. It was a revised offer for the Cross Ranch property, higher than the previous ones, significantly higher, high enough that it represented a number Pharaoh thought would be difficult to refuse. It was framed as generosity, as Pharaoh's acknowledgement of the ranch's value and his genuine desire to see a fair transaction. It was accompanied by language that managed, while saying nothing explicit, to suggest that the current difficulties around the property made it a reasonable time to consider new directions. Gideon read it twice. He handed it back to Clara. He thinks the fire worked, he said. He thinks you're unsettled and I'm worn down. He doesn't know what I found in the accounts, Clara said. What did you find? She had a second piece of paper folded in her other hand. She opened it and he saw columns of figures in her handwriting with annotations in the margins. Pharaoh has been using a man named Drew Calhoun as a land broker, she said. Calhoun has made purchases in this valley and the next on Pharaoh's behalf, always at undervalued prices, always from families who'd had some kind of trouble shortly before the sale. She pointed to the figures. 3 purchases in 4 years. 2 had fires. 1 had a crop failure that people thought was weather, but that the farmer always said didn't feel right. Gideon looked at the paper. Where did you get this? He said. Franklin Chi had some of it from other title research. Agnes Pierce had some of it. She keeps records of property transfers as part of the county clerk's filing system, which she helps maintain as a volunteer, and she was... Clara paused. She was glad to help when I asked her. She said she'd been wondering about some of those transfers for a long time. He looked at her. You went to Agnes, he said. I did, Clara said. A week ago. She's sharper than she's given credit for, and she has access to records that I don't, and she was glad to have a reason to look carefully at something she'd had a feeling about. He was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, with a kind of recognition that had been building over months of proximity, of watching her think, of seeing how she moved through problems. She had come to this valley with $30 and 4 children and a dead husband's failed homestead, and she'd made it to spring. She had done the accounts and found the errors and gone to Agnes Pierce with a theory, and built a case out of public records and one woman's careful memory. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. "Send it to the county land office in Helena," she said, "along with Franklin's arson filing and the title documentation. Let people with authority to act on it have it." She folded the paper carefully. "Pharaoh has been doing this for years. I don't think we're the only ones who've noticed. I think we might be the first ones who've put it in writing." He looked at the mountains above the property line, white still at the top, green starting below. He thought about sunlight being the primary enemy of men who operate in shadow. "Send it," he said. She nodded. He looked at her standing at the corral fence with her papers in her hands and the spring wind pulling at her coat and her hair. And he thought about everything she'd been: the woman in the scrap alley who he'd first seen through a window, the woman who'd fixed a wall with bare hands in the cold, the woman who'd knelt beside his hospital bed in the dark and changed the dressings on a burned hand night after night with steady hands and no complaint. He thought about what he'd told her, sitting in his bed, that he'd stopped believing what he saw about people because seeing had hurt him. He thought about her answer. "You see people clearly, Gideon. You just decided the scene would hurt you." He had been deciding that for 8 years. He was tired of that decision. "Clara," he said. She turned. She was already half turning back toward the main house with the papers, and she stopped and looked at him with those direct, undecorated eyes. He was standing at the corral fence with his healed, imperfect hand resting on the top rail in the late March light, in the valley he'd spent 11 years on, with the mountains behind him and the green coming up through the dead grass below, and the specific smell of spring mud and thawing ground, which was one of the best smells in the world if you'd lived through enough winters to understand what it meant. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever you answer, nothing about your situation here changes. The cabin is yours, the work is yours. That stays the same either way." She looked at him steadily. She was good at steady, but he could see her processing what he might be about to say, and there was something in her face that was not quite braced and not quite hoping, but some complicated mixture of both. "I know we've been here since winter," he said. He wasn't doing this the way he'd have wanted to, not finding the right words in the right order, but he pressed on because the alternative was stopping, and he'd been stopped long enough. "I know it hasn't been long enough for you to—" "It's been long enough," she said quietly. He looked at her. "What are you asking?" she said. He took a breath. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider this a permanent arrangement," he said. "The 4 of you, here. Not as work and housing, as—" He stopped. Started again. "As home. And whether you'd be willing to consider me as part of that. As family." The word landed between them in the spring air. It was not a word he'd said in relation to anything personal in a very long time, and it was the right word, which was why he'd found it eventually. Clara looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at the figures in the ledger. Not seeing through them, but seeing them exactly as they were. Not more, not less. The truth of the thing, plainly. "You'd be taking on 4 children," she said. "I know what I'd be taking on," he said. "Noah has strong opinions about how things should be done." "I've noticed that," he said. "I consider it an asset." Something moved across her face. Not the beginning of a smile this time, the full thing, brief and real, the kind that reaches the eyes before it knows it's happening. "Eli will break at least 3 things in the first week," she said. "Dutch broke 2 things last week and he's a grown man," Gideon said. "I've made my peace with things breaking." The smile didn't disappear this time. It stayed, quieter, something she wasn't trying to manage. "Yes," she said, simply, without decoration, the way she said everything that was true. He held her eyes. "Yes," he said, back, which was not an echo, but an answer. She turned and walked back toward the main house with her papers and her composed back and her hair pulled by the wind, and he stood at the corral fence and watched her go. And the horses moved behind him with their warm, living weight, and the spring ground was soft under his boots, and the mountains were where they'd always been, holding up the sky in their patient, enormous way. His hand ached in the cold. He didn't mind it. He turned back to the horses and the work, and the afternoon moved on around him, ordinary and irreplaceable, the way all good things are. The letter from the Helena land office arrived in the 2nd week of April, When the snow had finally surrendered the lower fields entirely and the creek was running fast and loud with melt. Franklin Chi brought it himself rather than trusting it to the post, which told Gideon before he even opened it that the contents mattered. They sat at the kitchen table, Gideon, Clara, Franklin, and Franklin laid out what had happened in the measured, careful language of a man who deals in precision. The land office had opened a formal inquiry into Del Ferro's acquisition practices in the Gallatin Valley. 3 other families had come forward once word moved through the right channels, each with their own version of the same story. Trouble arriving quietly before a sale was suggested, prices that seemed reasonable only if you were frightened enough to accept them. The arson filing had given the inquiry teeth. Ferro had not been arrested. Men like Ferro rarely were, at least not quickly. But his operations in the valley had been suspended pending review. His broker, Drew Calhoun, had quietly left the territory, and the land he'd targeted, including the Cross Ranch, was formally documented as protected from any coercive sale claim. "It won't ruin him," Franklin said. "I want to be honest about that. He has money and patience and lawyers better than me." "But he's finished here," Gideon said. "He's finished here," Franklin confirmed. "The valley knows what he was doing now. That's not a thing you recover from in a place this size." After Franklin left, Clara stood at the window looking out at the yard where Eli was conducting some complicated solo operation near the fence that involved a stick and strong convictions, and she was quiet for a long moment. "It's not justice exactly," she said. "No," Gideon said. "It's what's available." She turned from the window. "It's enough," she said. Not resigned, decided, the way Clara always landed on things when she'd thought them through completely. "It's enough for now." He looked at her and thought about the woman who had stood at his back door 8 years into his own silence and refused to be pitied and insisted on working for what she took and had walked into a fairground on his arm with her spine straight and her chin level. He thought about what it cost a person to decide that what's available is enough when what's available falls short of what's deserved. He thought that was not weakness. He thought that was the hardest kind of strength there was. They were married on a Saturday in late April in the yard of the main house, with Franklin Chi presiding because Franklin had the legal standing for it and was willing. Agnes Pierce was there, and Dutch and Hector and the other ranch hands, and a handful of families from the valley who had decided, over the course of a difficult winter, that the Cross household was something they wanted to stand alongside rather than stand apart from. It was not a large wedding. It was not a graceful one. Eli knocked over the small table that held the flowers Agnes had brought, and May cried for reasons that were unclear even to May. And June asked Franklin 3 questions about legal procedure during the ceremony itself, which Franklin answered with admirable composure. Noah stood beside his mother with his jaw set and his eyes clear, and when it was done and Gideon looked at him, the boy gave a single nod. Not performative, not a child's eagerness to please, just, "Yes, this is right." The acknowledgement of someone who has been keeping watch for a long time and has decided he can set it down. That nod cost Gideon something in the chest that he didn't try to name. He just received it. Summer came to the Gallatin Valley with its long days and its particular blue sky, and the grass going tall in the lower pastures. Gideon built a new structure where the burned shed had stood, proper this time, with good lumber and Dutch's careful carpentry, and Noah helping on weekends and learning things Gideon taught him without either of them making much of the teaching. The cabin that had been the foreman's quarters became the children's place, their domain, their drawings on the walls, their arguments, and their noise filling the space that had been empty. The main house was different now. It was not quieter exactly. 4 children changed the acoustic landscape of any structure permanently, but it was different in a way that Gideon found, to his own continued surprise, that he didn't want to reverse. He had lived alone in this house for 11 years and called it sufficient. He understood now that he had been rationing himself the way you ration food when you're not sure when more is coming, and that there was a difference between surviving on rations and living on something closer to enough. He was not a changed man. That was not how it worked, and he'd have been suspicious of any accounting of himself that claimed otherwise. He was still someone who preferred silence to noise in most circumstances. Still someone who found groups of people more tiring than a full day of fence work. Still someone who processed things slowly and internally, and arrived at conclusions long after other people had moved on. He still slept badly some nights. His hands still ached in cold weather. He still had, in the bottom of his desk drawer, 11 words that he had never thrown away, which Clara knew about and did not ask him to discard. Some things you carry not because you want to, but because they're part of the true account of who you are, and falsifying the account doesn't change the ledger. But he was someone who came home to a lit house now. He was someone who had a boy come and find him in the barn to show him a thing that had happened, and a girl who drew pictures and left them where he'd find them, and a small child who had claimed a specific corner of his kitchen as her own reading corner and looked up at him sometimes with her mother's same direct, assessing eyes. He was someone who sat across a table from a woman in the evenings after the children were settled and talked about things that mattered and was not afraid of what she'd see if she looked carefully. That was what courage had turned out to be. Not the fire, though the fire had been real. Not the fairground, though that had cost something too. It had been the smaller, daily decision to remain visible, to someone, to something, to the parts of himself he'd spent years boarding up and calling caution. In September, he carved a new sign for the gate at the end of the property road, replacing the weathered one that had just said Cross Ranch in plain letters for 11 years. He did it himself, on a Sunday afternoon, with Noah watching and asking questions about the tools, and Eli wandering in and out of relevance, and Clara sitting on the porch close enough to see. He carved Cross Family Ranch, established 1889, not never for sale. He'd thought about that and decided against it. A man who had to post a sign announcing what he wouldn't do was still letting the threat define him, and he was done with that. What he was what the sign said. The family. The land. The year they'd become the same thing. That was enough. That was everything. He hung it and stepped back. Eli immediately said it looked crooked, which required a 5-minute discussion and the conclusion that it was not in fact crooked, but that Eli's perspective from ground level was affecting his assessment. June said it was good. May said nothing but came and stood next to Gideon and leaned against his leg, which was her way of indicating approval. Noah looked at it for a long time. "It's good," he said finally. The same words June had used, but different in his mouth, weighted with the specific knowledge of a boy who remembered the before, who knew what the distance was between that December night and this September afternoon, and had walked every step of it. Clara came down from the porch and stood beside Gideon and looked at the sign. He could feel her beside him, her arm against his, her particular warmth, the fact of her. "It's permanent," she said, not a question. "It's permanent," he said. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. They stood in the September light at the gate of the Cross Family Ranch with their children around them and the mountains at their backs, and the valley spread out below, and the long grass moving in the afternoon wind. And it was imperfect and incomplete and entirely real. The frontier does not reward sentiment. It never has. It rewards endurance, practical skill, the willingness to be present in hard conditions without flinching, the ability to get back up and find what's still workable after the storm has taken what it wanted. Gideon had always understood that. He had built 11 years on it. What he had not understood, what the winter of 1889 had taught him at considerable cost to his coat and his hand and the careful walls he'd maintained since 1881, was that endurance alone was not the same as living, that you could survive everything and still be standing in a cold house by yourself with a cup of coffee going cold on the table, and call it sufficient and be wrong. Compassion is not a soft thing. He understood that now in a way he hadn't before. It is not the opposite of strength. It is the direction strength goes when it has enough left over to look outward. The boy who chose to feed 4 children in the snow chose the harder path, not the easier one. The man who stood in a fairground and put his name next to a widow's reputation chose difficulty with his eyes open. The person who goes back into a burning building for someone else's drawings is making a statement about what they believe has value in the world, and that statement is the truest accounting of who they are. He had been, for 8 years, a man with no one to give anything to, and he had not understood, until he did, that the giving was the point. The sign creaked slightly in the evening wind. The mountains held their ground. The children were already arguing about something near the barn, Eli's voice carrying above the rest, Noah's measured response rising to meet it. Clara turned back toward the house. "Supper," she said, to no one and everyone. Everyone came.